Settle yourself now, just as you are, into the softest place you can find. Allow your shoulders to lower, your breath to lengthen, and your eyelids to grow comfortably heavy. Tonight, you are not asked to remember anything, nor to follow any thread too closely. You are simply asked to drift. Imagine that we are standing together upon a quiet bluff overlooking the Atlantic, and the year is somewhere within the gentle haze of the late 19th century. Newport, Rhode Island lies hushed beneath a velvet evening, and the air carries the soft, briny perfume of the sea, mingled with the green sweetness of newly cut lawns and the faintest trace of wood smoke from a distant chimney. The horizon glows in long ribbons of rose, amber, and lavender, dissolving slowly into the deepening blue above. Beyond the wrought iron gates ahead, gravel paths curve like pale rivers between hedges of clipped boxwood. Lanterns flicker to life one by one, golden and patient, illuminating marble urns, ivy-covered walls, and the silent silhouettes of summer mansions rising from the cliffs like dreaming palaces. These are the homes of the Vanderbilts and their gilded piers, and we have been invited in the soft, weightless way of dreams to wander through them. There is no hurry here, no urgent voice, no harsh light. Only the hush of waves below, the creak of cooling stone, and the faint and faraway laughter of an evening that gently drifts even now toward a quiet and unhurried midnight. Before we step beyond the gates, let us pause for one quiet, unhurried moment, here at the threshold between the waking world and the long, slow dream of history. There is a small ritual that travellers like us have always observed before entering an unfamiliar place, the slipping of a calling card into a silver tray, the soft tap of a knocker against polished oak, the gentle nod that tells the household, "Yes, I am here, and I would like to return." If in the hush of this listening hour you find that your breath has begun to slow and that the candles of your mind are dimming kindly, then perhaps you might leave a quiet calling card of your own. Simple subscription, a small bell that whispers when a new evening like this is ready for you, a single soft gesture that costs nothing and asks for nothing in return. It is, in the kindest sense, the modern equivalent of being placed upon the guest list of these grand summer houses. Each new chapter, each new mansion, each new candlelit corridor and softly creaking staircase will then find its way to you in due time, gently, without effort, and without disturbance. And now, with that small, weightless task tucked neatly aside, like a folded handkerchief in a velvet pocket, we may turn together toward the great front doors that wait, tall and patient, beneath the deepening sky. Breathe in once, slowly, and we shall step softly inside together. The path that leads us inward begins, as so many of the great Newport approaches did, beneath an archway of wrought iron whose curling vines and hammered roses have softened over the decades into a gentle weathered patina. The metal, once a sharp and lustrous black, has eased into the colour of a dove's wing at twilight, dusted here and there with the faintest blush of rust where the salt air has lingered longest. Beneath our feet, the gravel makes a soft granular sigh with every step, each tiny pebble a pale ivory or oyster grey, sifted long ago from the local shore and raked each morning into long parallel furrows, by a gardener whose name is now forgotten by everyone but the stones themselves. To either side of this path the lawns roll outward in vast breathing expanses of green, so smooth and so impossibly even that they seem almost to have been brushed into place rather than mown. The grass holds the last warmth of the afternoon within its blades, and as the dew begins to settle you may catch the faintest sweet scent rising from it, that particular mingling of crushed clover, distant honeysuckle, and the cool dampness of earth releasing the day. Somewhere nearby, a bumblebee, drowsy and unhurried, traces a slow figure eight above a bed of creamy hydrangea, their blossoms heavy as snowballs upon their leafy stems. The mansions themselves rise gradually into view, not all at once, for the architects of these summer cottages, as their owners so playfully called them, understood that anticipation was itself a form of pleasure. First you might see only the suggestion of a roofline, a chimney pot, or the pale shoulder of a dormer window. half hidden behind the carefully shaped silhouettes of Copper Beech and Weeping Cherry. Then, as the path turns, the full facade unfolds itself, deliberate and theatrical, as though the house itself were taking a slow, gracious bow before you. Consider the stone of these buildings, the pale Indiana limestone, the warm Italian marble, the silver-grey granite quarried from the cool depths of New England earth. Each surface holds a history within its grain. Each carved leaf upon a cornice, each fluted column, each delicate balustrade has passed beneath the hands of stonecutters who travelled across an ocean to lend their craft to this particular shore. Some of those hands belong to artisans from Genoa and Florence, others from the small mountain villages of Carrara, where the marble itself was born in caverns of impossible white. They came across the Atlantic in long, slow voyages, bringing with them their chisels, their collopers, and the quiet music of their native dialects, which lingered in the air around the construction sites like a soft and foreign perfume. The cliff walk itself, that famous ribbon of public footpath which runs along the very edge of these private kingdoms, hovers a little way beyond the gardens, where the lawns dissolve at last into rough wild grass, then into the rocks, then into the great patient breathing of the sea. From there, far below, comes the constant lulling rhythm that has shaped every dream ever dreamt within these walls. The waves do not crash here so much as they unfurl, long and slow, against the dark, glistening shoulders of the cliffs, sending up gentle plumes of spray that catch the last gold of the evening before falling, soft as silk, back into the deep. Above the houses, the sky is now the colour of an opal, all milky pinks and faded violets threaded through with the first cool whispers of indigo. Gulls turn in lazy spirals high overhead, their cries softened by distance into something almost musical, almost a lullaby. The air smells of salt and of roses, of clipped grass and of the faintest wood smoke from a kitchen range somewhere within the great houses, where, even at this gentle hour, the staff are preparing for the long ceremonial evening to come. You may notice as we walk that every detail of this approach has been considered: the placement of each ornamental urn, the spacing of each flowering shrub, the precise curve of each path. All of it was conceived not by accident but by the studied imagination of landscape designers such as Frederick Law Olmsted and his many disciples. Men who believed that a garden was not merely a decoration but a kind of slow, unfolding poem written in living things. The visitor of the 1880s or the 1890s was meant to feel, by the time they reached the front steps, that they had been gently transported, that the ordinary cares of the working world had been left somewhere far behind the gates, dissolved into the lavender hedges and the cooling air. And here at last are those front steps, broad and low, of a pale honeyed marble polished by the soles of 1,000 satin slippers and patent leather shoes. They rise in a shallow welcoming arc toward the great doors. The doors themselves are of dark oak, carved with motifs of acanthus and laurel, their bronze handles cool and weighty, shaped in the form of lions' heads or scrolling vines, gleaming softly in the lantern light. To one side of the entrance stands a tall stone vase, taller than a child, brimming with cascading ferns and pale ivory roses whose petals are just beginning to loosen with the day's last warmth. The footman in livery, his coat of deep claret wool, his waistcoat of striped silk, his white gloves immaculate, stands so still beside the door that for a moment you might mistake him for one of the sculptures. He inclines his head, the smallest possible motion, the merest suggestion of a bow, and the door eases open without a sound, releasing into the cooling evening air a gentle exhalation of warmth, of beeswax, of distant violets, and of something else, something deeper, the layered, wordless fragrance of a house lived in by many lives, by many seasons, by many quiet candlelit dinners and slow afternoons of letter-writing. We pause for one breath upon the threshold. The light within is golden and unhurried. Somewhere far inside, a clock ticks softly, the brass pendulum swinging in its careful, patient arc, marking out the seconds of an evening that seems just now to have all the time in the world. The ocean breathes again behind us, far below the cliffs. The lanterns flicker. The footman waits, gracious and silent. And the great house, with its hundreds of rooms and its thousands of small glowing details, lies open to us, ready to be wandered slowly and dreamingly, like a long, beautiful book whose pages turn themselves at the gentlest possible pace. We need only step inside. The threshold marble is cool beneath our shoes, smoother than any stone you have ever felt, polished by countless careful crossings, each footstep absorbed into its long memory. The hush within the entry hall is the particular hush of houses that were built to hold music, and the air even now seems to be listening for the first soft note of a violin tuning somewhere on a distant landing above. The first chamber to receive us, the great hall of the breakers, is not so much a room as it is an atmosphere given architectural form, a vast and breathing volume of air enclosed by walls of carved corn stone, the colour of lightly creamed coffee, rising upward through 2 full stories of ornament until it meets a ceiling so distant and so richly painted that one must tilt one's head fully back to take it in. Above us, a sky has been imagined in oil and gilt, a soft cerulean dome scattered with tumbling cherubs and trailing garlands of pale roses, the whole composition framed by a coffered border of intricately carved oak leaves, each leaf veined and shadowed with such patience that the carvers must have lived inside this single ceiling for most of a year. The hall stretches some 50 feet from end to end, broad enough that a small carriage might once have been driven through it, and the proportions are so generous that the human figures within it seem for a moment beautifully small and weightless, like figures in a dream of childhood. The floor beneath us is a great inlaid mosaic of marbles, deep red and creamy ivory and the palest grey-green, arranged in long geometric ribbons and central medallions that draw the eye gently inward toward the heart of the house where a grand staircase begins its slow ascent. Run your gaze along the walls and you will find that there is no surface here that has not been considered. Every panel of stone has been carved with a delicate frieze of acorns, ribbons, or scrolling vines. Every pilaster is fluted, every capital crowned with the curling fronds of stylized acanthus. The doorways are framed with tall, slender columns of rose-veined marble whose surfaces have been polished to a depth that almost seems liquid, as though one could press a hand into them and feel the cool pressure of an inner pool. The light in this hall is a study in patience and in layering. By day, the great arched windows on the western facade allow long beams of afternoon sun to pour across the marble, turning it briefly the colour of warm honey. By evening, as now, the room is illuminated by a vast central chandelier of crystal and gilded bronze, hung upon a chain so long it seems to descend from a different world entirely. The chandelier holds within it perhaps 100 candle-shaped electric lamps, each one softened by a small fluted shade of frosted glass, each one casting its individual trembling halo into the cool air. Around the perimeter of the room, on slender bronze sconces, smaller flames mirror the great chandelier in miniature, so that the entire hall seems to glimmer, very gently like the surface of a still pond touched by a soft breath of wind. The scent of this room is unforgettable to those who knew it. There is first the cool mineral breath of the stone itself, that particular dryness peculiar to grand interiors carved from limestone and marble, faintly reminiscent of cathedrals and of ancient libraries. Layered upon that there is the sweet, mellow warmth of beeswax, applied each morning by a small army of housemaids who buff the carved oak doors and the stair railings until they glow with the deep, soft lustre of old amber. And, threaded through both, drifting in from the conservatory at the far end of the hall, comes the gentle floral perfume of orchids and gardenias, plants tended in hothouses by gardeners who know them by name. To the right of the entrance, a long console table of carved walnut supports an arrangement of fresh flowers, so vast and so perfectly composed that it seems almost a still life painted by a Dutch master. White lilies arch upward from the centre, their throats faintly blushed with green, their pollen the colour of saffron, around them sprays of ivory roses, blushing peonies, and trailing tendrils of asparagus fern soften the silhouette into something both grand and tender. Beside the arrangement rests a silver salver, where calling cards have been placed by visitors throughout the day, each one a small white rectangle bearing the engraved name of a Belmont, an Astor, a Golet, or some other figure of the season's social pageant. The grand staircase that rises from the centre of the hall is a marvel in its own right. a slow theatrical sweep of pale stone whose risers have been worn into the gentlest of curves by the soft passage of evening shoes over many summers. The balustrade is of deeply carved oak, its newel posts crowned with ornamental urns and shielded coats of arms, the wood so dark and so rich that it seems in the candlelight almost to be a very old red wine made solid. Upon the wall above the first landing hangs an enormous tapestry, a Flemish weaving from some quiet century before, depicting a hunting scene rendered in muted greens, dusty rose, and the faded gold of old leaves. The figures within it move in their woven stillness with a kind of suspended grace. The dogs forever leaping, the horses forever turning, the riders forever raising their soft horns to lips that will never quite blow. If you stand at the centre of the hall and listen, you may hear the faint and pleasant sounds of the house at work. Somewhere far above, on one of the upper landings, a chambermaid is humming softly to herself as she folds linens that smell of lavender and clean sun. From a distant doorway comes the discreet clink of silver upon silver, a butler arranging the spoons for the evening's first course. Beyond the closed doors of the music room, a piano is being tuned, and the slow wandering pings and adjustments of its strings drift through the carved oak with a kind of patient intimacy, like a person preparing in private for a small and beautiful task. The temperature here is gentle, neither cool nor warm, that particular mild equilibrium maintained by enormous quantities of skill and quiet labour, somewhere deep beneath us. In chambers we shall visit later, vast coal-fired boilers feed warmth through brass radiators concealed behind ornamental grills. Above us, the high ceilings allow the warm air to rise and dissipate, so that the great hall feels neither stifled nor draughty, but rather as though one had stepped into an ideal afternoon in some kind paradise where seasons have been perfected and refined. Cornelius and Alice Vanderbilt commissioned this house, you may recall, as their summer cottage, finished in the spring of 1895, designed by Richard Morris Hunt at the very pinnacle of his powers. The architect had wandered through the palaces of Genoa and Turin and the stately homes of England, drinking in their proportions and their flourishes, before composing this hall as a kind of letter of love to all of them at once. He understood that the first room of any great house must do the slow, generous work of welcoming the visitor, and so this hall does not shout, does not press itself upon the senses, but instead opens like a long, patient breath, allowing the eye to wander and to settle and to wander again. Fire glows quietly in the great fireplace at the eastern wall, its mantel a single slab of pale marble carved with cornucopias spilling forth fruits and flowers. The flames move in slow, lazy curls, occasionally sending a soft spark up into the dark mouth of the chimney. A footman has placed a single chair near the hearth, an antique armchair upholstered in a deep faded rose damask, its cushion gently sunken from many years of dreaming occupants. We might, if we wished, simply sit there for an hour and watch the fire and the chandelier and the slow pageant of the household drifting past, and the evening itself would feel as full as any concert. If the Breakers welcomes the visitor with the warm, breathing intimacy of carved oak and richly painted ceilings, the Marble House, just a quiet carriage ride farther along Bellevue Avenue, receives us in an entirely different mood, cooler, more austere, more crystalline, like stepping from the soft brown depths of a forest into the high, bright clarity of a mountain lake. Here, William Kissam Vanderbilt and his formidable wife Alva chose, with deliberate and dazzling intention, to construct what is essentially a temple of pure white stone, a building in which marble is not merely a material but a presence, silent and luminous companion that follows the visitor from room to room, from hour to hour, never quite letting one forget the cool, ancient stillness of stone itself. The approach to the Marble House is theatrical in its own restrained way. The drive curves through formal gardens kept in a state of nearly geometric perfection, the boxwood hedges trimmed into soft cushions, the gravel raked into long parallel lines, the rose beds arranged in concentric circles bordered by low stone edging. Then the trees part and the house emerges almost without warning, a great white temple lifted above a broad terrace of pale steps, its facade composed of fluted Corinthian columns rising 2 full stories to support a richly carved pediment, the whole building, facade and side wings alike, is sheathed in 500,000 cubic feet of imported white marble, a quantity so vast that even the most jaded eye must pause and recalibrate, must accept that yes, this is indeed an entire house wrapped in the same material from which Greek gods were once carved. The marble itself is not a single uniform white. As you approach the steps, you begin to see the subtle variations within it, the faint silver veins, the occasional drift of pale grey, the tender warm undertone where the afternoon sun has rested upon a particular column for many hours. There is the famous Numidian marble with its soft rose and amber clouds brought from quarries in the African mountains. There is the green marble of Italy, dense and cool as the bottom of a still pool. There is the deep yellow sienna marble, almost honeyed, almost edible in its richness. And throughout there is the pure Carrara, that legendary white whose grain seems to glow from within, as though some quiet light had been quarried out along with the stone itself. To enter the marble house is to step into the cool clarity of a particular ambition. The foyer opens into a soaring entrance hall whose floor is a vast inlay of pink, white and yellow marble arranged in a great central rosette, the lines of the pattern radiating outward with a precision that draws the eye forever back toward the center, like the slow, calm rotation of some ancient sundial. The walls here are sheathed in matching marble panels, each one bordered with delicate carvings of acanthus leaves and ribbon swags, each joint between panels so finely fitted that one must crouch quite low to find the seams. Above us, the ceiling of the entrance hall has been gently coffered, each recessed square bearing at its center a gilded rosette, and from the central coffer descends a chandelier of carved rock crystal, so heavy and so intricate that it required, when first installed, a team of craftsmen working for several days to suspend it properly. The crystals catch the cool northern light from a high arched window above the doorway, breaking that light into countless soft prismatic flickers that move very slightly upon the pale walls, as though the room itself were dreaming in slow colour. Listen, as we stand in this entrance hall, to the particular acoustic quality of marble. The smallest sound, a footstep, a whispered word, the soft rustle of silk skirts becomes amplified and refined, lengthened and clarified, the way a single struck note becomes a chord within the vault of a cathedral. The stone gives back every sound with a faint, beautiful echo, so that the room seems always to be holding the ghost of the previous moment, the previous breath, the previous step, in some shimmering acoustic memory just at the edge of hearing. The temperature within the marble house, particularly upon a hot summer afternoon, is a quiet revelation, even on the warmest of August days, when the lawns outside grow drowsy beneath the heavy sun and the cicadas begin their long pulsing song from the trees. The interior of the marble house remains cool, almost preternaturally so, the great quantities of stone holding within them the gentle chill of the previous night. Stepping inside from the bright dazzled heat of the gardens is to feel a soft, pleasing shiver pass over the skin, as though one had entered the shade of a forest grotto or descended into the cool dim chamber of a wine cellar, except that the surfaces here are luminous rather than dark, glowing softly with reflected daylight. The principal rooms unfold from the entrance hall along a measured axis. To one side, the gold room, that fabled ballroom whose walls and ceiling are sheathed entirely in carved gilded panelling, awaits its evening transformation. To the other side, the Gothic room offers a completely contrasting mood, dim and intimate, panelled in dark carved wood, lit by slender stained glass windows in jewel-like blues and reds, a private chapel of sorts to the medieval imagination. Ahead, the long dining room stretches outward in pink, Numidian marble and richly carved bronze, anticipating the slow procession of dinners that will pass through it across the seasons. Alva Vanderbilt, who oversaw every detail of this house with a determination that became legendary in her circle, intended the marble house to be a statement, declaration in stone of what an American woman of taste and ambition could conjure when given the resources of an industrial fortune and the freedom to follow her own vision. She had travelled in Europe, had walked the gardens of Versailles, had stood in the white halls of the Petit Trianon, and she returned to Newport carrying within her the silent decision that she would build, on the cliffs of her own country, a house that owed nothing to apology and everything to imagination. Richard Morris Hunt, that same architect who would later design the breakers for William's brother, was given the commission, and the two of them, architect and patroness, worked together over the course of nearly 4 years, debating proportions, selecting marbles, sketching cornices, until the house was completed in the summer of 1892. The total cost, by the rumours of the day, approached $11 million, an almost unimaginable sum for a private residence, of which $7 million were spent upon the marble alone. And yet, standing within it now, at this softening hour of the evening when the lanterns are being lit one by one and the vast hall is settling into its slow nighttime hush, the house does not feel boastful. It feels instead like a long meditation upon clarity, upon precision, upon the cool, patient beauty of geometry itself. The pale stone, the silver echoes, the gentle prismatic flickers from the chandelier, all of it conspires to slow the breath, to ease the eye, to invite the visitor into a state of wakeful, wandering tranquillity, the sort of feeling one might know in a great quiet museum at the end of a long, contented afternoon. Breeze drifts in through a tall opened window somewhere down the corridor, carrying with it the cool sea air and the faint distant sound of a wave breaking against the cliffs below. The breeze touches the crystals of the chandelier above us, and they whisper, ever so softly, their tiny glassy chime moving through the marble hall like the smallest possible bell, calling no one in particular, marking only the gentle passage of an hour that seems in this room, in this house, almost to have stopped altogether. Let us turn now down the long corridor that runs eastward from the great entrance hall of the marble house, our footsteps barely whispering upon the polished stone, our hand trailing for a moment along the cool pale balustrade. The corridor is broad and deliberately unhurried in its proportions, its walls lined with niches in which small classical statues stand in their pale dignity, each one a copy of some ancient figure from a Roman villa or a Pompeian garden, their stone limbs lit gently from above by recessed brass fixtures whose bulbs flicker just barely, an effect that lends the figures the soft impression of breath, of suspended life. We pause before a pair of double doors of carved oak, their surfaces inlaid with delicate patterns of ebony and mother of pearl, the brass handles cool and faintly green at their edges where many gloved hands have rested against them across the years. Footman, anticipating our approach, eases the doors open without a sound, and we step softly into the gold ballroom, that famous chamber which Alva Vanderbilt commissioned as the radiant heart of her summer house, a room so saturated with gilded ornament that to stand within it is to feel, for a moment, that one has entered the inside of a softly glowing jewel. The room is not so vast as one might imagine from the legends. It is, in truth, a chamber of chamber music proportions, perhaps 40 feet by 50, with a high coffered ceiling and tall arched windows along its eastern wall. But every surface within it has been gilded, carved, painted, or polished to such a degree that the eye, upon first entering, cannot quite settle, cannot quite decide where to land. And so the gaze must travel slowly around the room, gathering its pleasures one quiet detail at a time. The walls are sheathed in panels of carved gilt wood, each panel framed by a delicate border of acanthus leaves and ribbons. Between the panels rise tall pilasters, their fluted shafts gently rounded with the slow patience of the carver's chisel, their capitals crowned with elaborate compositions of cherubs, garlands, and scrolling vines, all rendered in the deep warm gold that recalls the colour of ripe wheat at sunset. Above the doorways, oval medallions hold painted scenes of pastoral romance, soft figures in 18th century dress strolling through dappled gardens, the colours faded into a tender palette of dusty rose, sage, and pale blue. The ceiling here is painted to suggest a celestial scene, a soft firmament of clouds parting to reveal allegorical figures of music, poetry, and dance. The figures drift in their painted weightlessness across the dome above us, their robes fluttering in some perpetual interior breeze, their hands extending instruments and laurels and roses toward one another in eternal, unhurried gesture. At the centre of the ceiling, suspended upon a chain of polished bronze, hangs a chandelier of carved rock crystal arranged in tiers like the petals of an opening flower, each crystal pendant catching the light and breaking it into countless small flickers that move gently across the gilded walls below. The floor of the ballroom is a marvel of inlaid woods, parquet de Versailles in its grand and traditional pattern, alternating squares of oak, walnut, and pale fruitwood arranged into intricate geometrical compositions, the surface waxed and polished to such a depth that one's reflection moves softly within it like a figure walking upon the surface of a still amber lake. When the room is in use during the season, when an orchestra plays from the slightly raised gallery at one end, and couples turn slowly in the long figures of a waltz, the floor itself seems to breathe with them, the layered marquetry creaking ever so faintly beneath the rhythm of slippered feet, the wax exhaling its slow honeyed perfume into the warm air. Imagine, if you will, an evening in the high season of the 1890s, when this room is filled with 200 guests, ladies in gowns of pale silk and shimmering tulle, their bodices embroidered with seed pearls and tiny rosettes, their long gloves reaching past the elbow, their hair piled high and ornamented with single jewelled combs or small clusters of fresh flowers. The gentlemen accompany them in tailcoats of inky black, their stiff white shirts crisp as folded linen, their patent leather shoes catching the chandelier light in tiny moving flares. The orchestra has begun a Strauss waltz, and the strings rise softly above the velvet rumble of conversation, the woodwinds threading their gentle melodies through the gilded air like shining ribbons. A pair of dancers turn in the centre of the floor, their movements unhurried, their posture instructed by years of practice and decorum. The lady's gloved hand rests lightly upon her partner's shoulder. The gentleman's gloved hand rests at the small of her back, and between them passes that small invisible understanding that allows the waltz to unfold without effort, the two figures revolving as though carried by the music itself, rather than driven by their own intention. Around the perimeter of the ballroom, gilded chairs of carved walnut have been arranged for those resting between dances. Each chair is upholstered in a deep rose damask, the fabric soft as the petal of an old garden rose, and beside each chair stands a small round table of inlaid marble, holding a tiny crystal glass of lemonade, a folded ivory fan, a delicate programme card bearing the names of the evening's dances printed in slender copperplate script. The programmes themselves are works of art, bound between covers of silk in pale pink or robin's egg blue, threaded with a small silken cord and a tassel. The scent within the ballroom is one of the gentlest pleasures of all. It is composed first of the pure, cool floral notes of the great arrangements that flank the doorways, white lilies and gardenias and tuberose, their perfumes so strong upon entering that it almost feels like a soft mist passing across the face. Beneath that, layered as in some exquisite perfumer's blend, is the warm honey of the beeswax upon the floor, the dry mineral note of the marble in the corridor beyond, the faint smoky sweetness of the candles in the wall sconces, and threaded through it all the elusive note of the season itself, of summer evenings of cooling stone, of the distant sea moving against the cliffs beyond the windows. Servants move through the room with a quiet grace that has been refined over many years of service. They wear the Vanderbilt livery, dark blue coats faced with silver white silk stockings and silver buckled shoes, and they carry trays of crystal champagne flutes whose contents catch the chandelier light in soft golden bubbles rising slowly toward the surface. Each flute is delivered with a small bow, accepted with a small nod, the entire transaction conducted in an atmosphere of such practised quietness that conversation never need pause for it. Beyond the eastern windows, which have been opened slightly to admit the cool evening air, the gardens of the marble house stretch away into the deepening twilight. From the distant lawn comes the faint, lulling rhythm of the sea against the cliffs, that constant, unhurried sound which has been the underlying music of this house since its first foundation stone was laid. The breeze that drifts in through the windows carries with it the salt and the cool grass, and the faintest trace of jasmine from a flowering shrub upon the terrace. We may stand here for a long, peaceful while at the threshold of the ballroom, allowing the scene to unfold without our needing to enter it fully. The dancers turn, the music breathes, the crystals tremble softly above, and the whole gilded world revolves at its own dreamlike pace, neither hurried nor slow, but settled into the perfect tempo of a summer evening that has all the time in the world to be itself, fully and unhurriedly, before the lanterns at last grow dim and the final notes of the orchestra dissolve into the long, listening hush of the Atlantic night. Let us drift now away from the ballrooms and the painted ceilings, away from the marble halls and the gilded mirrors, and step softly through a discreet side door into one of the most quietly enchanted corners of the Newport mansions. The conservatories, the glass houses, the long greenhouses tucked behind stone walls where, all year long, a patient and entirely separate climate is maintained for the pleasure of plants that would otherwise never have known a New England summer. Here, behind walls of warm condensation and panes of slightly wavering glass, the Vanderbilts and their neighbours cultivated whole indoor jungles of orchids, ferns, palms and citrus trees, miniature equators preserved within the cool latitudes of Rhode Island. The first sensation upon stepping into one of these conservatories is the sudden thickening of the air. After the dryness of the marble corridors, after the cool, clear breath of the gardens, the conservatory air settles upon the skin with a soft, humid weight that is at once strange and deeply pleasant. The temperature is a steady, gentle warmth, perhaps 75 degrees by the old measure, and within it floats a fine, almost imperceptible mist, the breath of countless plants exhaling slowly into the enclosed atmosphere. Within seconds your skin grows faintly damp, your hair curls a little at the edges, and a small bead of moisture forms upon the rim of your spectacles or the bezel of your wristwatch. The smell here is unlike anywhere else in the entire estate. It is, first and most immediately, the deep green smell of growing things, the chlorophyll perfume of stems and leaves as they go quietly about the slow work of photosynthesis. Beneath that lies the mineral richness of damp soil, of peat moss, of pebble drainage trays where small silvery puddles catch the diffuse skylight. Layered atop these earthen scents drift the various perfumes of the plants themselves, the sweet, almost intoxicating perfume of gardenia, the soft, buttery vanilla of certain orchid varieties, the faint citrus brightness of a small lemon tree carrying its waxy white blossoms, and in one corner, the unmistakable green pepperiness of geranium leaves brushed by a passing sleeve. Above us arches the long, curving roof of the glasshouse, its panes set into a delicate framework of white painted iron, each pane slightly imperfect in the manner of old hand-rolled glass, bearing within it tiny ripples and bubbles that bend the daylight into soft-moving patterns upon the leaves below. The iron framework itself is wrought into elegant filigreed shapes, with curling decorative finials at the joints and small fluted columns supporting the longest spans. By day, sunlight pours through this glass canopy in long greenish rays, broken by the silhouettes of palm fronds into shifting patterns of shadow upon the brick paths below. By evening, as now, the light comes from soft brass lanterns hung at intervals along the central walkway, their warm golden glow making the leaves around them look almost velvet black, their edges catching the light in tiny gleaming highlights. The path beneath us is paved with weathered red brick, each brick worn into a soft saddle shape by many years of the gardener's wheelbarrow passing across it. Between the bricks, in the narrow seams, tiny mosses have established themselves, fine and emerald bright, glowing faintly even in the low light. Along either side of the path stretch the long raised beds where the orchids grow, mounted upon weathered wooden frames or hanging in small wire baskets suspended from the iron framework above. Each orchid bears its name upon a small ivory tag tied to its stem with a length of green twine, the names written in careful copper plate by the head gardener, a man whose handwriting has been refined over decades into a thing of slow, leisurely beauty. Some of the orchids are in bloom, others are not. Those in bloom present their flowers with the air of careful sculpture, each petal arranged in geometries that seem almost impossible to have arisen from mere botany. There is the pale ivory cattleya, its trumpet streaked inside with deep purple, its lip crimped at the edges as though pinched by a tiny invisible hand. There is the slipper orchid, with its strange pouched lower petal gleaming like polished mahogany. There is the small white moth orchid, whose blossoms resemble nothing so much as flights of tiny pale butterflies frozen in mid-flutter along an arching green stem. The orchids of the Vanderbilts and their peers were, in their day, a kind of botanical aristocracy, They had been brought, often at considerable expense, from the cloud forests of Central and South America, from the highland jungles of Burma and Sumatra, from the shaded ravines of Madagascar. They had travelled in carefully constructed wooden cases lined with damp sphagnum moss, accompanied by the men known as orchid hunters, who spent their lives wandering remote rainforests in search of new and previously unknown varieties. To possess a rare orchid in 1890 was, for the very wealthy, the equivalent of possessing a small original painting by a master, and the head gardener of a great Newport estate would tend his collection with the same patient devotion that a curator might bring to a gallery of old masters. Beyond the orchid section, the conservatory broadens into a wider hall where palms rise on their slender trunks toward the highest part of the glass roof. There are date palms, fan palms, and the slender areca with its feathery green fronds, and beneath them clusters of staghorn ferns, their antlered fronds extending in soft greenish-grey arcs from the bark of the trees to which they cling. Small fountain plays at the centre of this hall, a low basin of pale stone, in which a slender bronze figure of a young naiad pours water from a tilted urn, the water falling in a gentle continuous trickle that catches the lantern light in tiny flickers upon the surface of the basin below. The sound of this fountain is the constant lullaby of the conservatory, layered beneath all the other smaller sounds, the faint creak of the iron roof as it expands and contracts with the changes of temperature, the soft drip of condensation from the underside of the glass panes, the distant chirp of a single canary kept in a tall brass cage at the far end of the hall, its yellow plumage glowing faintly through the green dimness. The canary sings in short, contented phrases, pauses, sings again, and somehow the rhythm of its song fits perfectly with the rhythm of the falling water and the slow unfolding breath of the plants themselves, so that the entire conservatory feels like one slow, patient, breathing being. A small wrought iron bench has been placed beside the fountain, painted the colour of old willow leaves, its seat softened by a cushion of dark green velvet. We may sit here for a moment, as the lady of the house herself sometimes did, in the quiet hour before dressing for dinner, her parasol resting across her knees, her gloved hand drifting absently over the cool tendrils of a passing fern. From this bench, the entire conservatory unfolds in a long perspective of greens and golds, the orchids floating in their tiny baskets like suspended dreams, the palms reaching upward toward the high glass dome, the fountain murmuring its endless soft confession. Beyond the panes of glass, the world of Newport continues its evening rituals. Carriages roll along the gravel drives, footmen lower the lanterns into place somewhere in the distance. A dinner bell sounds its low brass note, but here within the conservatory, in the warm, humid stillness, in the faint perfume of damp soil and tropical blossom, the rhythms of the outer world soften and slow until they become barely perceptible, and the listening visitor may settle deeper into the green hush, feeling time itself stretch and dilate the way the petals of a slow-blooming flower stretch and dilate across the long, unhurried hours of an unobserved afternoon. Let us follow now the slow pale light of a Newport morning as it climbs gently through the eastern windows of one of the family bedchambers, drawing across the carpets in long golden stripes, illuminating one quiet detail after another in the unhurried way that summer light alone seems to know. The bedchamber of a Vanderbilt lady is a chamber composed entirely of softness, of layered fabrics and soft textures, of gentle colours and patient reflections, a sanctuary in which the day begins not with abruptness, but with the most graceful of unfoldings. The bed itself stands at the centre of the room, a great four-poster of carved mahogany, its posts twisted into the slender spirals of the so-called barley-sugar style, its canopy hung with a long fall of pale silk damask in the colour of old ivory. From the canopy descend long curtains, drawn back at the corners and held by tasselled silken cords, allowing the morning air to drift gently across the pillows. The mattress is dressed in linens of an almost translucent fineness, the kind of linen that has been laundered hundreds of times, washed in lavender water, folded with sprigs of dried rosemary, and tucked between leaves of cedar for the long months of winter, until it has acquired that particular soft hand which only old domestic linen ever achieves. Upon the pillows, the lady of the house has been gently waking for perhaps a quarter of an hour, her eyes opening into the dim filtered light, her thoughts drifting quietly through the tasks and pleasures of the day to come. There is no harshness here, no sudden clamouring of bells or blasting alarms, for in a Newport mansion the morning announces itself only in the softest of ways: a discreet knock upon the door, the slight creak of a floorboard in the corridor, the faint distant rattle of a porcelain cup against a silver salver as the breakfast tray is carried up from the kitchens far below. The maid enters the room with the particular grace that has been refined through long apprenticeship. She is in her mid-20s perhaps, dressed in a clean black dress with starched white collar and cuffs, a small white apron tied at her waist, her hair drawn back into a smooth knot beneath a white linen cap. Her shoes have been polished to a soft sheen, but she walks upon the carpets in such a way that almost no sound accompanies her, only the faintest rustle of starched cotton as she moves toward the windows. She greets the lady with a quiet morning courtesy, then begins her gentle work of opening the heavy curtains. The curtains are of deep blue silk lined with cream, and they whisper softly along their brass rods as she draws them apart. The morning light pours in slowly, illuminating the air, and within that light 1,000 tiny dust motes drift and turn, each one a small suspended star, catching the gold and turning slowly in the breath of the awakening room. The lady watches them for a moment as she sits up against the pillows, her dark hair loose upon her shoulders, her eyes still soft from sleep. The breakfast tray is placed upon a small table beside the bed. Upon the tray rests a delicate china pot of hot chocolate, its glaze the colour of pale eggshell, painted with tiny garlands of pink rosebuds. Beside it stands a matching cup and saucer, a small silver pot of cream, a tiny silver spoon, and a folded linen napkin embroidered at its corner with the lady's monogram in pale blue silk thread. Upon a small porcelain plate rests a single fresh croissant, its crescents of golden pastry still warm from the kitchen, and beside it a tiny crystal dish of apricot preserves the colour of captured sunlight. Beside the breakfast itself, neatly folded, lies the morning's correspondence, 3 or 4 letters bound together with a thin silken ribbon, their envelopes addressed in various elegant hands. The lady sips her chocolate slowly, allowing the warmth to spread through her, allowing the day to begin. The chocolate has been prepared by the kitchen staff in the French manner, frothed with a small wooden whisk, sweetened with the finest cane sugar, scented with a single vanilla pod and a faint whisper of cinnamon. The taste is rich and warm and unhurried, and the steam rises from the cup in delicate spirals that catch the morning light before dissolving softly into the air. While she breakfasts, the maid moves quietly about the room, performing the small rituals that will prepare the chamber for the lady's day. The fire that has been laid in the marble fireplace is lit with a long taper, the small flames catching the carefully arranged kindling and rising slowly into a soft, warm blaze. The fire is not, strictly speaking, necessary, for the morning is mild and the radiators of the central heating system are already warm to the touch, but a fire in the bedchamber is a tradition, a comfort, a small visual companion, and so it is laid and lit each morning regardless. After her chocolate, the lady rises from the bed and slips her feet into a pair of soft kidskin slippers, their soles thin and supple, their tops embroidered with tiny silken flowers. Over her nightdress she draws a long dressing gown of pale rose silk, its sleeves wide and full, its hem trimmed with a delicate ruffle of cream lace. The gown drifts around her as she moves, soft as a cloud, and she crosses the room toward the dressing table. The dressing table itself is a marvel of craftsmanship, a tall piece of carved walnut with a triple mirror that opens like the wings of a great butterfly, allowing the lady to view her face from every angle. Upon its surface rest the tools of her toilette, all of them arranged with the practiced order of a craftsman's workbench. There are silver-handled hairbrushes engraved with her monogram, ivory combs with delicately fluted edges, small crystal flacons of perfume and rose water with silver stoppers, shaped like tiny urns, porcelain pots of cold cream and rouge, a slender silver salver bearing a pair of mother-of-pearl manicure tools, and a small velvet-lined tray holding a few favourite pieces of morning jewellery. The lady sits upon the embroidered stool before the dressing table, and the maid begins the long, careful work of arranging her hair, The hair falls heavy and dark down the lady's back, brushed first with the silver-handled brush in long, slow strokes that begin at the crown and travel all the way to the tips. The brush moves rhythmically, a gentle shoosh, 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 and the lady closes her eyes for a moment, letting the sensation of being attended to settle her further into the calm of the morning. After brushing, the maid begins to twist and pin the hair into the simpler morning arrangement. A soft chignon at the nape of the neck, secured with tortoiseshell pins, with a few delicate tendrils left loose at the temples to soften the line of the face. While her hair is being arranged, the lady lifts a small crystal flaken from the tray and applies a single drop of rosewater to each wrist, dabbing them softly together. The scent that rises is the scent of a morning garden in full bloom, the soft, sweet rose mingled with a faint, cool note of orange blossom, distilled in some quiet perfumer's atelier in Paris, and carried across the Atlantic in a small wooden case packed with straw. The choosing of the morning gown is a quiet, collaborative ritual. The maid suggests, the lady considers, and at last a pale lavender muslin is selected, light and cool and suitable for the morning's planned activities, which include perhaps a stroll in the gardens, a brief letter-writing session at the small escritoire in the morning room, and a quiet conversation with the housekeeper about the menu for the coming evening. The maid lifts the gown from its tissue-lined drawer in the great wardrobe, and together they ease it gently over the lady's head, the cool muslin whispering past her shoulders, settling around her in soft folds. Outside the windows, the gardens are coming alive in the new sun. A gardener can be seen far down the lawn, kneeling beside the rose bed, pruning small canes with steady measured snips of his shears. A pair of swallows turn in the bright air above the hedges. Somewhere far below, in the kitchen courtyard, a maid is hanging linens upon a line, the sheets billowing slowly in the soft breeze, white as drifting clouds. The day has begun, very gently, very slowly, in the unhurried manner of a world that has elected, against all the rush of the modern industrial age, to take its mornings at the pace of perfumed letters and silver spoons. For every gilded surface in a Newport mansion, for every polished parquet floor and every gleaming silver salver, for every perfectly arranged vase of orchids and every immaculately laundered linen napkin, there existed below stairs a vast and wonderfully ordered system of human labour, quiet engine that ran by candlelight and by gaslight and by the soft footfalls of those whose work was invisible to the guests above. Let us descend now very gently by the narrow servants' staircase that winds downward from a discreet door beyond the morning room, our hands sliding along a banister of plain dark oak worn smooth by the daily passage of countless palms. The staircase is steep and narrow compared to the grand sweeping marble of the main hall, its risers slightly higher, its landings smaller, its walls painted a practical cream above a wainscot of dark green that does not show the smudges of daily use. The light here is cooler, more direct, supplied by simple gas jets in plain brass holders, each one casting a small steady circle upon the staircase wall. The air carries different scents now, no longer the perfumed lilies and beeswax of the upper rooms, but the warmer, denser smells of the working house, of bread baking somewhere far below, of starch and steam from the laundry, of beef stock simmering for the evening's consommé, of soap and lemon oil and clean wet stone. We arrive at the foot of the stairs in the long basement corridor, a passageway of stone-flagged floor and whitewashed brick walls that runs the entire length of the mansion, connecting the various working chambers like the spine of a great patient creature. The floor is cool beneath our feet, the bricks pleasantly worn into soft hollows where the roots are most travelled at intervals along the corridor. Doors stand open to reveal the rooms within, each one a particular small kingdom dedicated to a particular small task. Through one open doorway we glimpse the silver pantry, where a footman in shirt sleeves and a long green baize apron is polishing a tea service of ornate Georgian silver, his hands moving in slow practised circles, the silver gleaming softly under the steady light of the gas lamps. The silver pantry is a chamber of long counters lined with green felt, of deep drawers lined with the same soft cloth, of glass-fronted cabinets in which gleam ranks upon ranks of silver objects, hundreds of them, tureens and ladles and fish slices and sauce boats and tea caddies and cake stands, and candelabra and salt cellars and pepper grinders and asparagus tongs and grape scissors. Each piece bears the family monogram, a simple, elegant V intertwined with delicate scrolling, and each piece must be polished regularly to maintain the soft, warm glow that distinguishes truly cared-for silver from the merely shiny. The footman works methodically through his ledger of pieces, applying a small amount of jeweller's rouge to a soft cotton cloth, working it gently into the silver, then buffing with a clean cloth until the metal regains its quiet luster. The faint, sweet smell of the polish, a combination of fine clay and oil, hangs softly in the pantry air. Further along the corridor we come to the kitchen itself, the great and beating heart of the working house. The kitchen at the Breakers, like those of its neighbouring mansions, occupies a grand vaulted chamber some 40 feet long, its ceiling supported by stout iron pillars, its walls lined floor to ceiling with the various working surfaces and storage spaces required by a staff that may, a busy summer evening, prepare a formal dinner for 40 guests of impeccable expectation. At the centre of the kitchen stands the great range, a vast cast-iron monument of cooking, easily 15 feet in length, its surface a chessboard of hot plates, simmering plates and warming plates, its many ovens arranged in 2 long banks at either end. The range is fueled by coal, which arrives daily in a constant rumble down the coal chute outside, and the maintenance of its fires is the responsibility of the youngest of the kitchen staff, a boy of perhaps 14 whose first duty each morning at 4 o'clock is to riddle the ashes, lay the new fires, and coax the great range gently back to its working temperature before the cook arrives. The cook herself is a woman of considerable presence, dressed in a long white apron over a dark dress, her hair pinned up beneath a starched white cap, her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She moves through her kitchen with the quiet authority of one who has spent 30 years among pots and pans, who knows by feel alone the precise moment at which a sauce will break, who can tell from the smell of a stock pot exactly how long it has been simmering and what it requires. Around her, a small army of kitchen maids and undercooks performs the various smaller tasks under her direction, the chopping of vegetables, the boning of fish, the preparation of pastry, each task assigned according to skill and seniority. The smells of the kitchen are layered and complex and constantly shifting. There is the deep, meaty richness of the stockpot that simmers all day at the back of the range, fed with bones and trimmings and aromatics and skimmed regularly with a long-handled spoon. There is the buttery warmth of pastry being rolled upon the marble pastry slab, the cool stone keeping the butter firm beneath the rolling pin. There is the bright, sharp brightness of lemons being zested for a sole meuniere, the green, peppery freshness of parsley being chopped, the deep round perfume of a beef joint roasting in one of the great ovens. Layered through all of it is the faint, smoky scent of the coal range itself, the constant background note of the working kitchen. Beyond the kitchen lies the scullery where the actual washing up takes place, a large stone-floored room with deep porcelain sinks and long wooden draining boards. Here the scullery maids labour through the long dishwashing campaigns that follow each meal. Their hands red and softened with hot water, their sleeves rolled high, their aprons dampened by countless splashes, they wash the everyday china in great wooden tubs of hot soapy water, then rinse in a second tub of cooler water, then dry with linen cloths fresh from the airing cupboard. The fine porcelain and the crystal are washed separately, with a far greater degree of caution, by the senior parlour maid herself, who has been trusted with the task because her hands are gentle and her concentration unwavering. Adjoining the scullery is the laundry, a chamber of steam and soap where great copper boilers suspend bubbling cauldrons of hot water above small coal fires. The household linens, the sheets and pillowcases and tablecloths and napkins pass through the laundry on a weekly cycle, each piece soaked, scrubbed, boiled, rinsed, blued, starched, mangled, dried, ironed, and folded by hands that have been performing these tasks for so many years that the motions have become a kind of slow domestic dance. The smell, here is the smell of hot soap and clean steam and the faint herbal note of lavender water added to the final rinse, a scent that will follow each linen back upstairs into the rooms of the family. Throughout these working chambers, the bellboard in the housekeeper's office rings its patient music. The various bells, each connected to a particular room above by a long network of wires and pulleys, jangling softly upon their springs whenever a member of the family or a guest summons assistance from above. The housekeeper, a stately woman in a black bombazine dress with a chatelaine of small useful objects, scissors, a thimble, a pencil hanging from her belt, stands at the bellboard and notes which room has rung, then dispatches the appropriate servant with a calm, efficient nod. The bells themselves make a soft, silvery sound that drifts pleasantly through the basement corridor, and there is something almost musical in the way the bellboard responds to the slow rhythms of the day, more frequent in the morning hours, quieter through the long afternoon, then rising again into a gentle evening crescendo as guests dress for dinner. The servants' hall, where the staff take their own meals, lies at the far end of the corridor. It is a cheerful chamber of plain whitewashed walls, of a long scrubbed deal table with benches on either side, of a tall pine dresser holding the staff's everyday china, plain white with a simple blue rim. Here the servants gather for their breakfast, their dinner at midday, and their supper after the family has been served. The food is good and abundant, prepared by the cook from the same fresh ingredients that go upstairs, though arranged in simpler dishes. The conversation around the table, when it occurs, is the gentle conversation of people who have lived and worked together through many seasons, who know one another's small habits and small kindnesses, who form, in their own quiet way, a kind of second family beneath the roof of the great house. When the long shadows of the late afternoon begin at last to soften into the deeper blue of evening, when the gardens lose their bright, sharp edges and merge gently into masses of darker green, when the lanterns along the drive are lit one by one and the great mansions begin to glow from within like enormous decorated lanterns themselves, then it is time for the most ceremonious moment of the Newport day, the moment that has been anticipated, prepared for, and rehearsed since the earliest hours of the morning. It is the dinner hour. Long before the first guest descends the great staircase, the dining room has been made ready in a slow and elaborate process that has occupied many hands across many hours. The dining room of the Breakers, to take it as our example, is a vast oval chamber of pink alabaster columns and gilded ornament, its ceiling painted with a soft sky in which the figures of Aurora and her attendants drift among pale clouds. Tall Protestantits' walls hung with great mirrors that multiply the candlelight into endless soft constellations. At the centre of the room stands the dining table, an extraordinary piece of mahogany joinery that may be extended, by the addition of carefully crafted leaves, to seat as many as 34 guests in formal arrangement. The table has been dressed by the parlour maids working under the housekeeper's quiet direction, with the finest of damask cloths, a single long expanse of woven Irish linen white as the foam upon a cresting wave, surface bearing within its weave a delicate pattern of leaves and flowers, visible only when the light falls across it at a particular angle. The cloth has been laid with such care that not the faintest wrinkle disturbs its surface, and along its edges falls a hem of hand-tatted lace whose airy patterns suggest tiny snowflakes captured in mid-fall. Down the centre of the table, in a long, unhurried procession, runs the centrepiece. At the Breakers, it is often a massive arrangement of fresh flowers gathered that very morning from the conservatories, white roses and ivory tuberoses and pale pink lilies arranged in 3 matching silver epergnes, whose tall stems and curving arms suggest miniature trees from a cooler and more silvered world. Between the epergnes are placed smaller silver compotes filled with hothouse fruit, glowing apricots, dark hothouse grapes, soft clusters of strawberries upon their hulled green stems, and small candied violets dusted lightly with crystallized sugar. Around the centerpieces stand the candelabra, 6 or 8 tall ones along the length of the table, each one of heavy silver wrought in the form of a slender tree, from whose branches rise 3 or 5 candles. The candles themselves are of pure beeswax, their wicks newly trimmed by the footman, each candle pressed gently into its socket so that it stands at precisely the same height as its neighbours, an army of pale soldiers awaiting their evening duty. At each place setting, the silver and porcelain have been arranged with an almost geometrical precision. The dinner plate, of pure white Sèvres porcelain bordered with a delicate band of cobalt blue and gold, sits centered before each chair. Around it, the silver is placed in the order in which it will be used, working from the outside inward, fish forks and fish knives at the outermost positions, then the meat forks and knives, then the smaller forks for the entrée course, with the soup spoon to the right of all the others. Above the plate lie the dessert spoon and dessert fork placed horizontally, awaiting the sweet course at the end of the long meal. To the upper left rests the small bread plate with a tiny silver butter knife laid across it. To the upper right stand the wine glasses, 4 or 5 of them in the formal arrangement, each one of cut crystal whose facets catch the candlelight in tiny moving stars. Above each plate, slightly to the left, rests the place card, a small rectangle of stiff cream paper bearing the guest's name written in the careful copperplate hand of the secretary. The cards themselves are tucked into small silver place card holders shaped like miniature shells or curling acanthus leaves. Beside each card lies the menu of the evening, printed by hand in elegant script upon a folded card, listing in French the procession of dishes that will unfold across the next 2.5 hours. The seating itself has been considered with the gravity due to a small diplomatic conference. The hostess and the host sit at the 2 ends of the long table, with the most honoured guests placed to their immediate right and left in descending order of precedence. The pairing of guests has been worked out in the morning, balancing the conversational temperaments of the company, ensuring that each lady is placed beside 2 gentlemen who will engage her in pleasant conversation, ensuring that no 2 persons who have recently quarrelled find themselves uncomfortably adjacent, ensuring that the political, financial and artistic interests of the company are distributed evenly along the length of the table like the careful distribution of weight in a fine ship. Before any guest enters, the room is given a final inspection by the butler, a tall and dignified man in white tie and tails, his collar starched to the precise crispness of his own quiet authority. He walks slowly around the table, adjusting the angle of a single fork by perhaps half an inch, straightening the position of a wine glass that has settled slightly off-centre, plucking with a discreet pair of silver tweezers an imaginary fleck of dust from the rim of a porcelain plate. Behind him 2 footmen move along the perimeter of the room, lighting the candles in the candelabra one by one with long brass tapers, the small flames blooming gently into the evening dimness, their reflections doubling and tripling in the great mirrors upon the walls. The chandelier above the table is lowered partway upon its chain, then raised again to its dining height, an old tradition that allows the lamps to be checked and the crystals dusted before the company arrives. The chandelier itself holds perhaps 50 small electric lamps in the form of candle flames, each lamp veiled by a tiny shade of frosted glass, the whole composition framed by tier upon tier of cut crystal pendants that catch the light and release it again in countless tiny rainbows that drift almost imperceptibly upon the painted ceiling above. When at last the dinner gong sounds, somewhere in the great hall outside, a low brass note that travels with mellow patience through the corridors, the guests begin their slow procession into the dining room. The host offers his arm to the lady of highest rank. The hostess takes the arm of the gentleman of highest rank, and the rest of the company follow in pairs 2 by 2 in the order arranged by precedence. The procession is unhurried, the conversation quiet, the rustle of silk gowns and the soft clink of jewellery forming a gentle music as the guests find their place. Once seated, the meal begins with the first course, often a delicate consommé clarified to such transparency that one may read the embossed monogram upon the porcelain bowl through its golden depths. The consommé arrives in a small procession, each footman carrying a tray bearing 3 or 4 bowls, each bowl placed silently before its intended guest, each placement coordinated with the others so that all the bowls of soup arrive at all the places at very nearly the same moment. The footmen move in a kind of choreographed silence, never crossing in front of one another, never interrupting a guest's conversation, never permitting a tray to clink or a sleeve to brush against a chair. The wines accompany the courses in their own slow procession, pale dry sherry with the soup, a chilled white burgundy with the fish, a rich red Bordeaux with the meat, a sweet sauternes with the dessert, And at last, in the smallest crystal cordial glasses, a fragrant brandy or liqueur with the coffee. Each wine is poured by the butler himself, who circulates around the table with a folded white napkin draped across his arm, his movements economical and silent, the bottle held with such steadiness that not a single drop is ever spilt upon the white damask. Through it all, the conversation rises and falls in its gentle waves. Topics of the day are discussed: the latest opera in New York, the prospects of a horse in an upcoming race at Saratoga, the fashions newly arrived from the Paris ateliers, the small political intrigues of Washington, the gossip of mutual acquaintances. Laughter occasionally lifts above the quieter exchange, a soft general laugh that ripples down the table when a particularly well-told story has reached its punchline. At the head of the table, the hostess presides with the calm assurance of one for whom this kind of evening has been the daily fabric of her life since girlhood, her eyes moving from guest to guest, ensuring that no one is left without conversation, no glass left empty, no plate taken away too soon or left too long. Far above the candlelit theatre of the dining room, far above the slow rituals of the great public chambers, there exists in every Newport mansion a particular wing of the upper floors that belongs to a different and far quieter kingdom altogether. The children's wing, where the youngest members of the Vanderbilt family pass their long summer days under the patient guidance of governesses and nurses in a world of small chairs, soft toys, painted wallpaper, and 1,000 gentle rituals of childhood. The children's wing is reached by ascending the grand staircase to its second landing, then turning down a corridor whose carpet softens to a thicker pile, and whose walls are hung with framed prints of nursery rhymes and illustrated fables, soft watercolours of Mother Goose and the Three Bears, of Little Bo Peep wandering among her flock, of a fox in a waistcoat playing a fiddle beneath a hawthorn tree. The light here is gentler, supplied by smaller wall sconces with soft pink shades that cast a tender rosy glow upon the corridor floor, lending the entire passage the quality of a long quiet afternoon in some perpetually golden hour. At the end of the corridor, a doorway opens into the day nursery, the principal chamber of the children's domain. This is a large bright room facing east, its windows curtained in soft yellow chintz patterned with small bouquets of forget-me-nots and primroses, its walls papered with a delicate scene of pastoral life in the manner of an old Italian fresco, soft hills, drifting clouds, miniature shepherds with their gentle flocks, and an occasional small castle upon a distant rise. The nursery is large enough that one might walk a dozen paces in any direction without encountering an obstacle, but the various groupings of furniture have softened its scale, dividing it into smaller areas for play, for lessons, for quiet moments. In one corner stands the great rocking horse, a magnificent piece of nursery craftsmanship, his coat a soft dappled grey, his mane and tail of real horsehair, his eyes of deep glass that gleam softly when the light catches them, his saddle of red leather with tiny brass studs, his bridle and reins of fine leather likewise studded. He stands upon his curved wooden rockers, 6 feet long from nose to tail, large enough that a child of 7 may climb upon him and feel like a small cavalry officer setting forth upon a long-imagined campaign. The rocking horse is named Pippin, his nameplate engraved in tiny letters upon his saddle, and the children speak to him softly when they pass by, sometimes patting his nose, sometimes offering him an imaginary lump of sugar held in a small open palm. In another corner stands the dollhouse, a model of a great country mansion in miniature, perhaps 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, its facade hinged to swing open like the cover of a great book. Within, the dollhouse holds room after room of perfectly furnished tiny chambers, the drawing room with its tiny piano whose keys actually sound when pressed with a fingertip, the dining room with its tiny silver candlesticks no larger than a thimble, the bedrooms with their tiny embroidered coverlets and tiny porcelain washstands. The dolls who inhabit the house are themselves works of patient craftsmanship, their porcelain faces hand-painted, their tiny dresses sewn from offcuts of the finest silks and muslins, each one bearing a name and a small written history that the children have invented across the long summer afternoons of their play. Long, low table stands in the centre of the room. its surface scuffed and softened by years of use, and around it are arranged 6 small chairs upholstered in rose damask. Here the children take their tea each afternoon, attended by the nurse and watched, when she is not occupied elsewhere, by the governess. The afternoon tea of the nursery is a lighter affair than the formal tea taken downstairs by the adults, but it is conducted with a quiet sense of ceremony nonetheless, for it is in such small daily rituals that the children learn the manners that will accompany them into adulthood. The tea is poured from a small porcelain pot painted with rabbits in waistcoats. The cups are small and matching, each one holding perhaps a quarter of the volume of an adult cup. The milk is rich and cold, drawn from the dairy that morning, and the sugar comes in small lumps which the children may pick up with miniature silver tongs. The bread and butter has been cut into tiny triangles by the kitchen staff, the crusts neatly removed, and beside the bread sits a small porcelain dish of strawberry jam glowing red as a tiny sunset. There are also small biscuits in the shape of stars and flowers, baked that morning in the kitchens, and on special occasions a small slice of plain pound cake decorated with a single candied violet. The governess, a woman of perhaps 30, is an essential figure in this small world. She is dressed plainly but neatly in a dark grey skirt and a simple white blouse with a high collar, her hair drawn back into a smooth knot. She has been hired for her education, which includes excellent French, passable German, the rudiments of music and drawing, a thorough knowledge of English history and literature, and a sound understanding of the geography of Europe. She conducts the children's morning lessons in a smaller adjoining room called the schoolroom, where a long table is laid with copybooks, pencil cases, inkwells, and the various textbooks appropriate to each child's age and progress. The lessons proceed at a measured and unhurried pace. The youngest child practices her letters, forming a careful row of A's in a copybook, her tongue caught at the corner of her mouth in concentration. Her older sister works at French dictation, the governess reading slowly from a small book of fables, the child writing each phrase with care, occasionally pausing to spell a difficult word aloud. The eldest child, a boy of 10, is occupied with arithmetic, working through a series of long division problems whose answers he checks against the small leather-bound key the governess has placed beside him. When lessons are completed and the morning has eased into its later hours, the children are taken outside for their daily walk. They are dressed for the occasion by the nurse and her assistant in the small dressing room adjoining the nursery. The boys in sailor suits of pale blue serge with white collars and small black neckties, the girls in dresses of fresh white muslin with broad sashes of pale blue or pink silk tied at the waist. They wear straw hats with ribbons and gloves of soft white cotton. Their shoes are of polished kid leather with small silver buckles, and around the neck of each child is hung a tiny silk pouch containing a folded handkerchief, embroidered with the child's initial in pale blue thread. The walk takes them down through the gardens and along the beginning of the cliff walk, where they may pause to look out at the Atlantic and watch the gulls turn slowly in the bright air above the cliffs. The nurse holds the youngest child by the hand. The older children walk a little ahead, accompanied by the family's small dog, a fluffy white spaniel named Daisy, whose paws make tiny prints upon the dewy grass. They speak in low voices to one another, exchanging the small confidences of childhood, the secret games they have invented, the imagined adventures of their dolls, the names they have given to particular trees in the garden. Above them, the sky is high and pale, and the sea breathes its constant patient breath against the cliffs below, and the morning seems to stretch outward into a kind of permanent gentle eternity. Upon their return to the nursery, the children are dressed in lighter clothes for the afternoon, and after a short rest, the long quiet afternoon of play begins. There is the doll house to be rearranged, the rocking horse to be ridden upon imaginary expeditions, the picture books to be read, the watercolours to be painted upon thick paper at the small low table. The room fills with the soft sounds of childhood, the quiet murmur of a child speaking to a doll, the gentle thump of the rocking horse upon his curved rockers, the small splash of water in the painting jar, the soft scratching of a pencil across a sketchbook page. In the evenings before bed, the children are bathed in the nursery bathroom by the nurse, who fills the small enamelled tub with warm water from the tall brass taps, and adds a small handful of fragrant bath salts that turn the water a soft pale blue and release into the room the gentle perfume of lavender and rosewater. After the bath, the children are wrapped in great fluffy towels, warmed on the brass towel rail, then dressed in nightclothes of soft white cotton, trimmed with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. They kneel briefly beside their small beds for their evening prayers, their eyes closed, their hands folded, their voices small and clear in the quiet room. Then they are tucked into their narrow brass beds, the linens cool and smelling of lavender, the coverlets pulled up to their chins, and the nurse reads a single chapter of a book to them, her voice soft and unhurried, until their eyes grow heavy and the long, gentle Newport night begins to draw them down into the deep and dreamless sleep that only contented children can know. The Vanderbilts and their fellow grandees of the Gilded Age did not simply move from house to house, they migrated, in the long, slow, choreographed manner of seasonal birds, following an elaborate annual itinerary that was as fixed and as ceremonious as the pageantry of the natural year itself. The understanding of this migration is essential to any imagining of life within these mansions, for the Newport summer, brilliant as it was, formed only one chapter in a much longer book, and the great houses themselves spent more of each year quietly waiting in their wrapped and shuttered slumber than they did in active occupation. The annual cycle began traditionally with the winter season in New York, that long stretch from late autumn through the dying days of February when the great families of the metropolis settled into their Manhattan townhouses for the months of opera, ball, dinner, and theatre. The townhouses themselves were grand structures along Fifth Avenue and the side streets of the upper 50s and 60s, narrow when measured against the Newport mansions but soaring upward in their 5 and 6 stories, their facades of brownstone or limestone richly carved with the same classical motifs that adorned their summer counterparts. Within, the rooms were tall and richly furnished, the ceilings painted, the walls hung with old masters and family portraits, the libraries stocked with thousands of leather-bound volumes whose spines glowed softly in the firelight. The New York winter was the social heart of the year. The Metropolitan Opera season opened in the autumn with grand performances that the great families attended in their boxes. The ladies in long evening gowns of pale satin and cascading jewels, the gentlemen in white tie and tails, their opera glasses lifted occasionally to study a passing acquaintance in another box across the gilded horseshoe. The famous Mrs. Astor's ball, held each January in her grand house on Fifth Avenue, marked the highest peak of the winter calendar, and the engraved invitations to that ball, embossed with the family's monogram, were the most coveted small rectangles of paper in all of American society. As February gave way to March, the families would begin their first migration of the year southward to Florida and the warmer climates, or eastward across the Atlantic to the spas of Europe. Many of the Vanderbilts and their peers spent the early spring at French resorts, such as Aix-les-Bains or Biarritz, taking the waters, walking in the gardens of casino hotels, attending small concerts of chamber music in the long quiet salons. Others travelled to Italy, to the villas of Tuscany or the lakes of Lombardy, where the spring came earlier and gentler than in New York, and the air carried the soft perfume of citrus blossoms and early roses. The journeys themselves were undertaken in considerable comfort, in private railway cars whose interiors resembled small drawing rooms, with velvet upholstered chairs, brass-fitted writing desks, marble wash basins, tanned silver tea services for the long, unhurried meals taken as the landscape rolled past the windows. By late spring, the families would return to New York for a brief reprieve, the city emerging from its winter into the soft green of its parks and squares, the awnings of the cafes appearing along Fifth Avenue, the riding paths of Central Park filling with the morning equestrians. But this was a brief interlude, for the great migration of the summer was already being planned. The Newport season did not begin in earnest until the early days of July, but the preparation of the houses, the airing of the rooms, the polishing of the silver, the laying in of the kitchens, the repair of any winter damage, the planting of the gardens, all of this occupied the staff of each mansion through the long, slow weeks of May and June, so that the family might arrive in Newport to find their summer house already breathing, warm and fully alive. The journey from New York to Newport was itself a small ceremony. Some families travelled by train in their private railway cars attached to the regular service that ran along the Connecticut shore. Others travelled by yacht sailing up Long Island Sound and rounding Point Judith into Narragansett Bay, the great white sails catching the morning breeze. The family seated upon the polished teak deck under linen awnings, sipping iced tea from tall crystal glasses, watching the green coastline slide slowly past. The most elaborate yachts of the era were small floating mansions in their own right, with mahogany-panelled saloons, enamelled bathrooms, separate cabins for the family and the staff, and even small libraries of carefully selected books for the long, unhurried passages between ports. Once arrived in Newport, the family settled into the rhythms of the summer season, which would unfold across the months of July, August, and the early days of September. The season had its own elaborate calendar of regular events: the casino tennis tournament, the Newport Yacht Club regattas, the polo matches at the polo grounds, the charity bazaars and afternoon teas and dinner parties and balls. There were the fancy dress balls in which guests appeared in elaborate costume, sometimes spending many thousands of dollars upon a single costume, dressing as figures from history or from mythology, as Marie Antoinette, or as Cleopatra, or as the goddess Diana. The costumes designed by Parisian couturiers and assembled with the help of teams of seamstresses working through the long quiet hours of the night. The mornings in Newport were given over to private pursuits and quiet exercise. The gentlemen often rode along the carriage paths of the cliff walk, their horses fresh from the stables, their riding habits of deep navy or chocolate brown, their hats set at the precise angle dictated by fashion. The ladies might walk in the gardens, ride in the small open carriages along Bellevue Avenue, attend a morning lecture or concert at the Newport Casino, or pay calls upon their close friends in the neighbourhood. The afternoons were given over to the more public displays, the carriage drives along Bellevue Avenue at the fashionable hour, when the open landaus and victorias and barouches paraded slowly past one another, the ladies within them seeing and being seen, the gentlemen on horseback nodding gravely from beside the carriages, the entire pageant unfolding at the slow walking pace of a horse rather than the bustling speed of the modern city. The evenings, of course, belonged to dinner and the great social occasions which we have already described in our wandering through the dining rooms and the ballrooms. But there were also smaller evenings, the quieter at-homes in which a family might receive a few intimate friends for an unhurried supper, followed by music in the drawing-room, or the long evenings spent in the library before the fire, the gentlemen discussing the affairs of their businesses while the ladies worked at delicate embroidery or read aloud from a favourite book, the children long since asleep upstairs in their nursery. By the early days of September, the Newport season would begin to fade. The first cool nights of late summer would arrive, the leaves of the maples along Bellevue Avenue would begin their slow turn toward yellow and orange, and the families would begin to think of their next migration. Many would travel briefly to their country estates in the Berkshires or the Hudson Valley, large rural mansions surrounded by hundreds or thousands of acres of farmland and forest, where the autumn was given over to the pleasures of horse riding, fox hunting, and the gathering of the harvest from the estate's orchards and gardens. Others would board their yachts for a final cruise, perhaps to Bar Harbor in Maine, perhaps to the southern coasts before the weather turned. By the first frosts of late October, the great Newport mansions would be carefully closed for the winter. The process of closing the house was as elaborate as the process of opening it. The furniture was covered with white dust sheets, transforming each room into a chamber of pale, ghostly shapes. The chandeliers were wrapped in cheesecloth bags to protect their crystals. The clocks were stopped, their mainsprings released, their pendulums removed and stored in soft cloth. The silver was packed away in green baize-lined chests in the strong room. The art was checked for any signs of damage. The libraries inventoried, the linens laundered and folded into cedar-lined chests. Through the long quiet months of winter, while the family lived in New York or travelled in Europe, the great houses stood empty under their dust sheets, attended only by the small skeleton staff who remained to maintain them, the caretaker, the head gardener, a single housekeeper. The wind off the Atlantic howled around the carved cornices and the marble columns. The snow piled in soft drifts upon the lawns. The lanterns along the drives stood unlit. And within the silent mansions the rooms waited in their patient hush for the slow turning of the year that would bring the family back in the next bright early summer to wake the houses once more into their full glittering life. Adjoining each of the great Newport mansions, set discreetly back from the principal house behind screens of clipped hedges and ornamental trees, lay another and equally beautiful building, tone that occupies a curiously underappreciated place in the imagination of those who study these vanished worlds. This was the stable block, the carriage house, the equine quarter of the estate, a building that, in its own way, was as carefully designed and as lovingly maintained as the mansion it served. Let us walk softly down the gravel path that leads from the main house to the stables, our footsteps quiet, the air around us cooling into the long blue dusk. The stable block at the Breakers, designed like the main house by Richard Morris Hunt, is itself a small palace, a long building of warm red brick with tall arched windows and a steep roof of slate, its central archway framed by a stone pediment carved with a horse's head in profile. Above the arch a small clock tower rises into the sky, its weather vane in the form of a galloping horse turning gently in the evening breeze. Through the arch we may see the cobbled courtyard within, where the carriages are washed and prepared, and beyond it the doors that lead into the stalls themselves. The cobbles beneath our feet as we pass through the archway are the small rounded river stones of New England, set into the courtyard with such care that the surface, although bumpy in the manner of all true cobbles, holds a kind of regularity to it, the stones graded by size and laid in subtle radiating patterns that draw the eye toward the central drain. The cobbles glisten faintly in the lantern light, dampened from the afternoon's washing, and tiny puddles in their interstices reflect the soft gold of the sconces upon the courtyard walls. The smell here is unforgettable to anyone who has ever loved the old world of horses. It is the warm, rich smell of well-kept stables, layered and complex and infinitely pleasant to the senses of those who recognize it. There is, first, the deep, warm note of the horses themselves, the sweet hay-sweetened breath of healthy animals well fed and well cared for. Beneath lies the mineral fragrance of clean straw bedding, the dry, sweet earthiness of fresh oats in their feed bins, the soft leather perfume of saddles and bridles hung from their wooden pegs in the tack-room, the particular polished smell of the carriages themselves, with their lacquered wood and their oiled brass fittings, and somewhere beneath it all the very faint but unmistakable whisper of horse manure being attended to with fresh straw and careful tending in the far stalls. Through a wide doorway off the courtyard we enter the principal stall block. Here the horses of the household, perhaps a dozen in number, are housed in spacious individual stalls of polished oak, each stall topped by a brass nameplate engraved with the horse's name in flowing script. The horses are creatures of considerable beauty, their coats brushed to a high gleam by the stable boys, their manes and tails plaited or combed depending upon their use. There is the great bay carriage horse named Triumph, 16 hands at the shoulder, his coat the colour of polished mahogany, his black mane combed straight and falling along the right side of his neck. Beside him stands his matched companion Prelude, also bay, also 16 hands, the two of them so similar in colouring and conformation that they seem to have been bred together in some careful equine matchmaking. Across the aisle stand the riding horses, lighter and more refined in their build, their coats the colours of nutmeg and ivory and dappled grey. There is the gentle mare named Larkspur, whose patient temperament makes her the favoured mount of the lady of the house, and there is the spirited stallion called Argus, ridden only by the eldest son, who handles him with the careful confidence of a young man newly aware of his own command of horseflesh. There are also the children's ponies, smaller and shaggier, their forelocks falling over their eyes, their personalities each as distinct and individual as those of the children who ride them. Above each stall a hayrack of polished oak holds a generous amount of fresh sweet hay, and beneath it a feed manger stands stocked with oats and crushed barley, and the small handful of dried apple slices that each horse receives as an evening treat. The water buckets are kept full and fresh, the buckets themselves of polished copper that catches the light in soft warm gleams. The straw bedding upon the floor of each stall is deep and clean, and slightly springy beneath the hoof, replenished and freshened twice each day by the stable boys whose work, although humble, is essential to the welfare of the animals in their charge. In a chamber adjoining the stall block lies the tack room, a cool wood-panelled chamber whose walls are entirely lined with pegs and racks for the storage of saddles, bridles, harnesses, blankets, and the countless smaller items of equine equipage. The saddles hang in long rows upon their wooden saddle horses, each one a thing of patient craftsmanship, the leather oiled to a soft dark sheen, the silver fittings polished, the stirrup irons gleaming. There are side saddles for the ladies, with their distinctive curved horns and their longer skirts, and there are jumping saddles, hunting saddles, and the heavier carriage harnesses with their many buckles and traces and decorative brass fittings. The bridles hang upon their hooks, each one inscribed with the name of the horse for which it has been specifically fitted, the leather supple from regular oiling, the bits gleaming in the lantern light. Single chair stands in the centre of the tack room beside a small wooden table where the head groom sits during the long quiet hours to mend a strap or to polish a fitting, his hands moving with the slow practised patience of a man who has cared for horses since childhood and who finds in this work a deep and abiding peace. Beyond the tack room lies the carriage house proper, a vast hall of polished concrete floor and tall arched ceiling, illuminated by long rows of brass lamps and by the natural light that pours through the high windows during the day. Here are housed the carriages of the family, perhaps 15 or 20 different vehicles, each suited to a particular purpose and a particular season. There is the grand barouche used for the formal afternoon drives upon Bellevue Avenue, with its black-lacquered body and its yellow wheels and its silk-lined interior. There is the lighter Victoria for shorter calls and ladies' drives, its top folded back to allow the lady within to be seen and admired. There is the brougham, an enclosed carriage suitable for evenings and inclement weather, its windows curtained in soft blue silk. There is the dog-cart for sporting use and the phaeton for the gentleman's morning drive. There is the great drag, a four-in-hand coach for grand occasions when the family wishes to drive itself, rather than be driven, with seats upon the roof for the more daring of the company. Each carriage stands upon its own designated spot, immaculate, polished, oiled, ready to be brought out at a moment's notice. The lacquer upon the bodies is so deep and so brilliant that one may see one's own reflection in it, slightly distorted by the curving panels. The brass lamps at the front of each carriage are polished to a high gleam, their wicks trimmed, their oil reservoirs filled. The cushioned interiors smell of their fine leather and of the small lavender sachets that have been tucked beneath the cushions to keep them sweet. The work of preparing a carriage for use is itself a small ceremony. When the family announces, perhaps half an hour in advance, that a carriage will be required for an afternoon drive, the head coachman receives the message and selects the appropriate vehicle. The stable boys roll the carriage out into the courtyard where they wash the wheels with soft sponges, brush the upholstery and polish the brass once more for any small smudges acquired during its rest. The horses are brought from the stalls brushed thoroughly, their hooves picked clean with the small iron hoof picks, their manes and tails finely combed. The harnessing of the horses is a piece of slow, elegant choreography. Each strap is buckled in its proper sequence, each trace adjusted to its precise length, each ornamental fitting straightened and aligned. The horses, accustomed to this routine since their earliest training, stand patient and still, their ears flicking gently, their breath visible in the cooler air of the courtyard. When the harnessing is complete, the coachman climbs upon the box, the footman takes his place at the rear, and the carriage stands ready, the horses' hooves shifting slightly upon the cobbles in the soft musical sound that has accompanied departure since the dawn of the carriage-driving age. When the family at last appears at the front of the main house, the carriage is brought around, and the great moment of departure unfolds. The footman descends to open the door, the small folding step is lowered, the gloved hand of the lady is taken to assist her into the cushioned interior. The gentleman follows, the door is closed with a soft, expensive click. Then the coachman gives the gentlest flick of his long whip above the horses' backs. The horses lean into their harness, the carriage moves forward, the gravel crunches softly beneath the wheels, and the great vehicle rolls out of the gates and into the long evening. Among all the rooms of a great Newport mansion, there is one that perhaps most rewards the quiet, contemplative visitor, that breathes most deeply with the long, slow patience of accumulated thought, that carries within its walls the gentle whisper of 1,000 minds across many centuries, and that is, as you may already have guessed, the library. Let us turn our slow steps now toward this most reflective of chambers, our footsteps softening as we approach, our voices instinctively dropping into the hushed register that great rooms of books have always invited. The library at the Breakers, as at most of the Vanderbilt houses, occupies a deep corner room at the rear of the principal floor, away from the more public reception spaces, its windows facing the gardens and the sea beyond. This particular orientation has been chosen with care, for libraries are best illuminated by the cool indirect light of a north or eastern aspect, light that does not fade the spines of old leather bindings nor warm the rooms beyond a comfortable temperature for reading. The walls of the library are panelled in carved walnut, dark and rich, and gleaming softly in the lamplight, the panels rising the full height of the room and crowned by a deep cornice carved with garlands of laurel and oak leaves, the traditional motifs of literary distinction. Within the panelling set into the walls upon all four sides of the room are the bookcases themselves, tall recessed bays of more delicate joinery, each bay framed by slender pilasters and topped by a small carved pediment. The bookcases rise from a height of about 3 feet above the floor, allowing for a low shelf along the bottom upon which folio-sized volumes are stored flat, and they extend upward to a height of perhaps 14 feet. The highest shelves accessible only by means of the slender brass rolling library ladder that runs upon a track around the perimeter of the room, and that may be moved silently with a gentle push. The books upon these shelves number in the thousands. They have been gathered slowly across decades by a family of considerable cultivation and considerable resources. Many were acquired through the great booksellers of London and Paris, whose agents in the 1880s and the 1890s served the new American collectors with the same patient deference they had once given to dukes and earls. Other volumes were purchased at the sales of older European libraries, when the collections of an impoverished noble family were dispersed by the auctioneer's hammer, and the books crossed the Atlantic in carefully packed crates of cedar lined with waxed paper. The bindings themselves are a quiet visual feast. There are calfskin bindings of deep oxblood, their spines tooled in gold with delicate fleurons and bordered with thin gilt rules. There are vellum bindings, ivory pale and almost luminous, their lettering hand inscribed in faded brown ink. There are morocco bindings of dark green and deep blue, their grain visible when the light falls upon them at an angle. There are buckram bindings of more recent origin, a dignified but more practical choice for the working volumes of the library, and there are here and there the truly precious bindings in which the leather has been embossed with the family's coat of arms, or in which a celebrated bookbinder has inlaid contrasting leathers to form elaborate designs of intertwined flowers and vines. The smell of the library is the deep, contented smell of old books gathered in great numbers, a scent that some have called the perfume of wisdom itself. It is composed first of the soft, sweet leather of the bindings, mellowed across decades into a dark, warm note that is at once dry and rich. Beneath that lies the gentler smell of the paper itself, the particular faintly vanillic scent of old rag paper as it slowly oxidizes, releasing its soft compounds into the room across many years. There is the dusty mineral note of the binding glues, the sharper green fragrance of the leather oil with which the bindings are periodically conditioned, the soft beeswax of the panelled walls, the faint distant smell of the small wood fire that burns quietly in the marble fireplace at one end of the room. All of these scents combine into the particular and unmistakable atmosphere that is unique to old libraries everywhere. The fireplace itself is a particular feature of the library, a deep hearth set into the eastern wall, its mantel a slab of dark green marble veined with white, supported by carved walnut consoles in the form of seated griffins. Above the mantel hangs a portrait, an oil painting of an ancestor of the family, perhaps the founder of the great fortune himself, his face dignified and contemplative beneath a brow of considerable intelligence, his hand resting upon a volume of philosophy as though to claim even in death the contemplative life as part of his legacy. In the centre of the library stands the great library table, an enormous piece of joinery, perhaps 12 feet long and 4 feet wide, its top of dark mahogany inlaid with a leather panel of deep claret red, the leather tooled at its edges with a delicate gilt border. The table is large enough that several persons may work at it simultaneously without disturbing one another, and at the moment we observe it, its surface holds a quiet collection of objects that suggest its various uses. There is the day's newspaper, folded once and laid neatly to one side. There is a small writing case open upon the table, its interior lined with green felt and holding several sheets of cream-coloured writing paper bearing the family's monogram embossed at the top, along with matching envelopes, a small bottle of black ink, 2 pens of polished ebony with gold nibs, bronze blotter shaped like a small rocker, and a stick of red sealing wax. To one side of the table rests a tall lamp of green-shaded glass, the shade a soft jade colour that casts a gentle pool of light upon whatever surface lies beneath it. The shade is held aloft by a slender bronze stem fixed into a heavy bronze base, and the base itself is engraved with a delicate pattern of laurel leaves. When the lamp is illuminated as it is now in the gathering dusk, the green light spills across the table in a circle perhaps 3 feet across, illuminating the pages of the open book, or the lines of the letter being written, while the rest of the table and the rest of the room remain in a softer, more distant warmth from the smaller wall sconces and the gentle flickering of the fire. In one corner of the library, near a window that overlooks the gardens, stands a small writing desk that belongs particularly to the lady of the house, a delicate piece of French marquetry inlaid with floral patterns of rosewood and satinwood, top scattered with the small implements of personal correspondence. Here she writes the many letters that form the slow currents of social life in her time. There are letters of invitation to be sent, letters of acceptance to be received, letters of condolence and congratulation, letters to her dressmaker in Paris specifying the colours and fabrics of next season's gowns, letters to her sister in New York, letters to her elder daughter who is travelling on the continent, letters to her younger son away at school. The writing of letters in this era is itself a slow art, and the lady moves through it with practised grace. She begins with the salutation, written in her flowing copperplate, the words tilting gently to the right, as she has been taught since childhood. She pauses occasionally to consider a phrase, to choose between 2 synonyms, to recall a piece of news that should be included or omitted. The pen moves across the paper with a soft scratching sound, and at the end of each line she pauses to dip the pen into the small bottle of ink, the gold nib emerging dark and shining, ready for the next line. When a letter is completed, she sets it aside upon the desk to dry for a few moments, and then she takes up the bronze blotter and rocks it gently across the surface of the page to absorb any remaining excess of ink. Only then does she fold the letter into thirds, slip it into its envelope, address the envelope in her elegant hand, and seal it by dripping a small spot of red wax upon the flap, into which she presses her personal seal, leaving an embossed impression of her monogram or some other symbol that has become her private mark. Pile of completed letters grows slowly through the afternoon upon the corner of her desk. They will be collected by the butler at the end of the day and dispatched by the household to the Newport post office, from which they will travel by train and steamship to their various destinations across the country and across the Atlantic. Some will reach their recipients within a day or 2, others within weeks. The slowness of this correspondence is not felt as a frustration but as a natural rhythm, a current of communication that flows at the pace of horses and ships and that allows for the gradual unfolding of relationships across the long patient calendar of the year. Around the fireplace, several deep armchairs and a long sofa have been arranged in a comfortable grouping, upholstered in dark green leather softened by years of use, their cushioned arms and seats sunken gently into the welcoming hollows that come with long acquaintance. Here members of the family or their guests may settle for an unhurried hour of reading, a small side table within reach for a glass of port or a cup of tea, a brass standing lamp casting its soft illumination over the open page. The fire crackles softly, the clock upon the mantel ticks its patient tick, and the library holds its visitor in a slow, warm embrace of contemplation that may continue almost without notice for the entirety of an evening. Let us sit now for a long quiet moment at one of the tall windows of one of the upper floors of one of the great mansions, looking out across the gardens and the cliffs and the long, slow breathing of the Atlantic, and allow ourselves to drift into a more contemplative current. There are certain hours in any old house, certain particular qualities of light and stillness, when the building itself seems to pause and to gather, when the stones and the timbers and the carved ornaments seem briefly to hold their long memory close to the surface, available for a moment to anyone patient enough to listen. This is one such hour, the hour just before sunset, when the air softens and the colours of the sky begin their slow transition through every shade of warmth before settling into the deep blues of evening. Consider, as we sit here, the strange and beautiful fact that these mansions of Newport were built almost entirely within a single generation, between the 1870s and the early years of the 20th century, and yet they were built to last for centuries. The marble of the marble house, the limestone of the breakers, the oak and walnut panelling of the elms, all of these materials were chosen with the explicit intention that the houses would still stand in beauty and in dignity when the great-great-grandchildren of their builders had themselves passed into history. The architects spoke openly of building for the ages, of creating monuments that would endure as the great country houses of England had endured, as the villas of Renaissance Italy had endured, as the chateaux of the Loire had endured. There is something almost touching when one thinks about it slowly, in the contrast between the brevity of the human lives that conceived these houses and the long patience of the stones from which they were made. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who commissioned the breakers, lived to see only 4 summers in the completed house before his health gave way and he passed quietly from the world. William Kissam Vanderbilt and Alva, who built the marble house, were divorced within 4 years of its completion, and the house that had been the symbol of their marriage outlived their union by more than a century. The houses themselves, however, in their patient stone permanence, hardly noticed these small human dramas. The marble continued to glow softly in its halls. The painted ceilings continued their painted skies. The bronze doors continued their slow oxidation into the gentle green of long age. The houses, it seems, lived upon a different and slower clock entirely. This contrast between human time and architectural time is perhaps the deepest of all the meditations that these places offer to the contemplative visitor. Each of the mansions, in its way, is a monument to the proposition that something might be made which would outlast its makers, that beauty wrought into stone could survive the brevity of human breath. The desire to build such monuments is older than recorded history. It is the same desire that built the pyramids, that raised the cathedrals, that carved the temples of Karnak and the palaces of Persepolis. And the Gilded Age of America simply added its own American chapter to this very ancient human story, the story of mortal hands shaping immortal stone in the hope of leaving some small mark upon the long indifferent face of time. Yet there is a tenderness, too, in the way these houses have aged. Walk through them now, more than a century after their construction, and you will find that they have not become museums in the cold sense, frozen and lifeless. They have rather settled into themselves the way a long married couple settles into the comfortable, easy posture of their many years together. The marbles have lost their sharp newness and acquired the soft mellow patina that only stone can develop with age. The wood of the floors has darkened gently, accepting into itself the records of countless footsteps. The paintings on the ceilings have softened, their colours merging slowly into a gentler harmony, the way the colours of an old tapestry merge as the centuries pass. Even the gardens, which one might think the most fleeting of all the elements of these estates, have acquired their own deep sense of permanence. The boxwood hedges that were planted in the 1890s have grown into ancient living walls, their roots spreading deep into the New England soil, their thousands of small leaves replenishing themselves season after season with the same quiet persistence they have shown for over 100 years. The copper beeches that were saplings when the houses were new have grown into great spreading patriarchs, their lower branches now sweeping the lawns, their canopies sheltering a deeper and richer shade than any architect could have imagined. The sea, of course, attends to all of this with its own patient unconcern. The Atlantic that breathes against the cliffs below the mansions has been doing so since long before the first surveyor walked these bluffs with his measuring rod, and it will continue long after every house upon Bellevue Avenue has at last yielded to the patience of weather. The waves that we hear now, soft and distant in the evening hush, are the same waves in their essential rhythm that lulled the Vanderbilt children to sleep, that accompanied the grand carriage drives along the cliffs, that formed the constant musical background to every dinner and every dance, and every quiet morning of letter-writing across the long bright summers of the Gilded Age. There is perhaps a particular kind of peace available only to those who learn to listen to this slower clock, the clock of stones and waves and slowly growing trees. The world we live in now is loud with its hurry, full of its rapid pulses and its blinking screens and its constant urgent demands for attention. The world contained within these old mansions, by contrast, runs upon a fundamentally different cadence, a cadence that may at first feel almost inert to the modern ear, but that reveals, as we settle into it, entire orchestra of patient sounds and patient colours and patient changes that the faster clock simply does not have the leisure to hear. Consider the way the light moves through one of the great galleries of the Marble House across the slow course of a single summer afternoon. The light enters first through the eastern windows in the morning, illuminating one side of the room, casting long bright rectangles upon the marble floors. As the morning progresses, those rectangles shorten, their angles softening, their brightness intensifying, until by midday the light pours straight down through the high clerestory windows and fills the whole room with a diffuse luminosity. Then in the afternoon the light begins its slow westward migration, the rectangles reappearing upon the opposite walls, their edges softening as the sun lowers, their colour warming from white to gold to amber. And finally, as evening approaches, the light fades from the room entirely, replaced by the gentle electric illumination of the chandeliers and the wall sconces. Across that single afternoon, the marble of the gallery has been illuminated in 1,000 subtly different ways, has been seen in moods ranging from cool morning crispness to warm afternoon mellowness to twilight softness. To stand within that gallery for the entirety of a summer afternoon, watching the light move and change, is to receive a kind of education in patience that the modern world rarely offers. The light teaches its slow lesson, the stone receives it, and the visitor who has the leisure to attend may carry away a small permanent gift, a renewed capacity to notice the long unhurried rhythms of the natural world. The mansions of Newport, then, are not simply museums of a vanished social order, although they are that. They are also living invitations to slow down, to listen, to observe, to permit the long currents of time to wash gently over the modern soul that has become so accustomed to its hurry. Within their patient stone walls, time itself moves more gently, the hours stretch and dilate, the visitor breathes more deeply, the tight knots of the modern mind begin, ever so slowly, to loosen. Perhaps this is part of why these places continue more than a century after their building to draw such crowds of quiet visitors, why people still wander through their gardens and their halls in such respectful hush. We come, perhaps without even being fully aware of why we come, in search of this older rhythm. We come to remember that there was once a world in which a letter took 2 weeks to travel from New York to London, and yet was answered with patience and care. We come to remember that there was once a world in which the preparation of a single dinner party occupied the entire daily labour of a dozen people, and yet was undertaken with a kind of cheerful pride. We come to remember that a house, properly built, could be the work of many hands across many years, and could stand thereafter as a kind of long collaborative poem written into stone, available to be read by anyone who has the patience to walk slowly through its rooms. The evening deepens further now, and the long shadows of the cypresses stretch eastward across the lawn, and the first faint stars begin to appear in the indigo sky above the Atlantic. Somewhere in the gardens below, a single late bee can be heard, working her last patient circuit among the closing blossoms before returning to the hive for the night. The house behind us settles slightly upon its foundations, the old wooden joists making small contented sounds as they cool, and in this gentle hour between the bright life of day and the deep mystery of night, the entire estate seems to draw a long, quiet, contented breath, and to wait, with the unhurried patience that has become its essential character for whatever the next slow hour may unfold. Among the many things that linger most quietly within these mansions, perhaps the most easily overlooked are the countless traces of the hands that shaped them, the thousands of artisans, craftsmen and labourers whose patient work brought every carved cornice, every painted panel, every tiled floor, and every wrought iron railing into being. We have spoken of the architects and of the patrons, but the houses themselves were not in any meaningful sense the work of those few individuals. They were rather the collaborative achievement of vast networks of skilled workers whose names have largely vanished into the soft mist of historical anonymity, but whose work remains even now a living testament to skills that have, in many cases, themselves nearly vanished from the modern world. Consider for a moment the work of the stone carvers. When the great blocks of marble and limestone arrived at the construction sites in Newport, they came as rough-hewn rectangles from the quarries, their surfaces still bearing the marks of the saws and the wedges that had freed them from the mountainsides. To transform these rough rectangles into the delicate fluted columns, the elaborate carved capitals, the ribbons and roses and acanthus leaves that adorn every cornice and pediment, required the slow, patient work of master carvers who had often trained for 10 or 15 years before being permitted to undertake such commissions. These carvers came largely from Italy and from the long traditions of Italian stone carving, from villages in the Apennines and the Carrara region where the craft had been passed from father to son and master to apprentice for many centuries. They brought with them their own tools, chisels of various sizes and shapes, mallets of dense beechwood, calipers and dividers of polished brass, small bow drills for the most delicate work. Each carver carried his tools in a wooden chest with his name inscribed upon the lid, and the tools themselves often bore the marks of generations, the handles softened by the grip of multiple hands, the metal of the chisels honed and re-honed countless times upon the whetstone. The work proceeded slowly. A single Corinthian capital with its elaborate composition of 2 tiers of acanthus leaves topped by curling volutes might occupy a single carver for 3 or 4 months of patient effort. The carver would begin by sketching the design upon the rough block, transferring it from a small drawing made by the architect or by his own master. Then, using his largest chisels, he would rough out the basic forms, removing the bulk of the unwanted stone in long, careful strokes. Gradually, as the form emerged, he would shift to smaller and smaller chisels, refining the leaves, hollowing the volutes, articulating the small details of veining and texture that would give the finished capital its sense of natural plant life rendered in eternal stone. The carver sang as he worked in the quiet way of men whose hands are occupied with skilled labour. He sang the old songs of his village, the love songs and the harvest songs of a place that lay across an ocean, half a world away. The other carvers, working at nearby blocks, occasionally took up the songs in chorus, their voices blending with the steady tap, tap, tap of the hammers and the chisels, so that the construction site filled, hour after hour, with a soft music of work and memory and quiet companionship. Visitors to Newport in the 1890s, walking past the construction sites of the great mansions, would often pause to listen to this strange polyphony, the songs of distant Italian villages mingling with the percussion of stone shaping, and would carry away with them a small auditory souvenir of a craft tradition that was already even then beginning to recede into history. Consider also the work of the wood carvers, whose contributions are visible in nearly every panelled room, every banister, every doorframe, every elaborate ceiling. These artisans came from various traditions, some from England, some from France, some from Bavaria and Switzerland, but they shared a common apprenticeship in the slow, patient work of transforming raw timber into living ornament. Their workshops, set up in small frame buildings adjacent to the construction sites, were temples of order and quiet concentration. The walls were lined with their tools, hundreds of them, gouges and chisels and rifflers and rasps, each tool hung upon its dedicated peg, each tool maintained in a state of razor sharpness by the daily attention of its owner. The wood itself was a source of constant fascination and respect. The great mansions called for the finest woods available, walnut and oak from carefully selected American forests, mahogany shipped up from Honduras and Cuba, satinwood from the West Indies, ebony from Africa. rosewood from Brazil. Each wood had its own character, its own grain, its own response to the chisel and to the polishing cloth. Skilled carver could read the grain of a piece of walnut with the same attention that a literary scholar might bring to an ancient manuscript, anticipating where the wood would yield easily and where it would resist, where the grain would catch the light and where it would absorb it, where the natural patterns of the timber would enhance the carved design and where they would need to be subtly compensated for. The carved oak ceilings of the breakers with their thousands of individual ornamental elements represent perhaps thousands of cumulative hours of patient labor by teams of carvers working across many months. Each acorn, each oak leaf, each twisted ribbon, each small heraldic shield was carved separately and then fitted into the larger composition like pieces of a vast wooden puzzle. The work was done largely on the ground in the workshops, the various pieces being lifted into place only after they had been carved and finished, and many of the carvers never saw the final assembled ceiling in its proper position high above the rooms of the great house. The plasterers and the fresco painters formed yet another network of skilled craftsmen, many of them again drawn from Italian traditions but joined by artists from France, Germany and Austria. The decorative plaster ceilings of the Vanderbilt mansions, with their elaborate compositions of cherubs and garlands and trompe-l'oeil architectural details, required teams of plasterers working from elaborate scaffolds that filled the rooms during the construction phase. The plasterers worked quickly when they had to, for plaster sets within hours and cannot easily be reworked, but the speed of their work was the speed of long-practiced skill, the kind of speed that can only emerge from many years of careful training. The fresco painters worked alongside the plasterers, often beginning their painted compositions while the plaster was still slightly damp, allowing the colours to penetrate into the upper layer of the surface and to bond with it as it dried. This was the ancient technique of true fresco, a technique that had been used in Italy for many centuries and that produced paintings of extraordinary durability and depth of colour. The painters worked from elaborate cartoons, full-size drawings of the intended composition, transferring the lines of the drawings to the wet plaster by a process of pricking small holes along the lines, and then dusting the cartoon with charcoal to leave a faint outline upon the surface beneath. The colours used in these frescoes were the traditional pigments of the long European painting tradition, ground from minerals and earths and mixed with water at the moment of application. There were the rich blues made from ground lapis lazuli and from azurite, the deep reds made from cinnabar and from madder lake, the warm yellows made from ochre and orpiment, the soft greens made from malachite and from the verdigris that forms upon copper. Each colour was prepared fresh each morning by an apprentice, ground in small porcelain mortars, mixed in small porcelain dishes, and brought to the master painter as he worked upon his scaffold. The metal workers contributed yet another stratum of skill to these houses. The wrought iron railings, the bronze door fittings, the elaborate gas chandeliers and electric fixtures, the copper rooftop ornaments, all of these were the products of forges and foundries where craftsmen worked in heat and in noise to produce objects of remarkable delicacy. The wrought iron staircase railings of the marble house, with their delicate scrolling patterns of interlaced acanthus leaves and floral rosettes, were forged in a workshop in New York City by a master ironworker named Jules Allard, who had trained in Paris and who maintained his American workshop the same disciplined traditions he had absorbed in his French apprenticeship. The textile craftsmen were equally numerous and equally skilled. The silk damasks and brocades that covered the walls of the great drawing rooms were woven on hand looms in Lyon and in Italian silk towns, the patterns repeated across many bolts of fabric so that the same wall covering could be reordered if any panel were ever damaged. The carpets that softened the floors were knotted by hand in Persia and in Turkey, then shipped across the seas to be cut and fitted to the precise measurements of each room. The lace curtains that veiled the windows were tatted by women in convents in Italy and Belgium, their tiny, intricate patterns the product of countless hours of patient handwork. All of these craftsmen, working in their hundreds and their thousands across the long years of the building of these houses, formed a kind of vast collaborative orchestra, each section contributing its particular voice to the grand symphony of the finished mansion. Their individual names have largely been forgotten now, but the work of their hands remains, glowing softly in the lamplight of every room, a quiet and continuing tribute to the slow, patient skills that built the Gilded Age and that made these houses, even now, into the silent and beautiful collaborative poems that they are. There is a particular melancholy that hangs softly over any reflection on the great Newport mansions, a quiet wistfulness that arises not from anything tragic in their stones, but from the simple fact that the world that built them, the social and economic world of the late 19th century American aristocracy, did not last. The era we have been describing, with its elaborate seasonal migrations and its hundreds of household servants, and its dinners for 40 served upon hand-painted Sèvres porcelain, was already, even at the moment of its highest brilliance, beginning the slow imperceptible curve of its long decline. Consider, as we sit beside the cooling fire in the great drawing-room of one of the mansions, the long arc of historical change that was already, in the 1890s, gathering its slow momentum. The great fortunes of the Vanderbilts and their peers had been built largely in the railroads and in the steel mills, and in the early industrial enterprises of the post-Civil War decades. By the turn of the 20th century, those industries were beginning to transform themselves under new pressures, new regulations, new tax structures. The federal income tax introduced in 1913 would change forever the calculation by which great fortunes had been accumulated and preserved. The estate tax, following close behind, would begin the slow erosion of the dynastic wealth that had made the great mansions possible. The First World War, which began in the summer of 1914 and continued for 4 long years, brought further changes. The European world from which so many of the Newport craftsmen had come, the Italy of the stone carvers, the France of the textile weavers, the Bavaria of the wood carvers, was disrupted and transformed. The flow of skilled artisans across the Atlantic slowed and then largely stopped. The patient apprenticeships that had produced the master craftsmen of the Gilded Age were interrupted, and many of those traditions, weakened by the war and by the subsequent social upheavals, never fully recovered. Within the great families themselves, the long transition from one generation to the next began to reveal certain unavoidable arithmetic. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore, had founded the family fortune. His son, William Henry Vanderbilt, had nearly doubled it through the consolidation of the railroad networks. But William Henry had 8 children, and each subsequent generation had its own children, and each successive division of the fortune meant that the resources available to any single individual descendant became smaller, even as the costs of maintaining the great mansions remained substantial or grew. By the 3rd and 4th generations, even the most prudent of the Vanderbilt heirs found themselves managing only fragments of the original fortune, fragments that might still have constituted considerable wealth by ordinary standards, but that no longer supported the elaborate scale of life that the great mansions had been built to accommodate. The First World War brought also a profound change in the social atmosphere itself. The world of formal calls and engraved calling cards, of elaborate dressing for dinner, and of the slow, stately pace of the old social life began to seem, to the young people who came of age during and after the war, increasingly anachronistic. The new generation, having seen the trenches of France or having waited at home for letters from those who had, was less inclined toward the long ceremonious dinners and the elaborate fancy dress balls. Their pleasures ran more toward the cocktail party and the jazz club, toward the swift modern pace of the new century rather than the stately rhythms of the old. The Great Depression, which began in October of 1929, accelerated all of these changes dramatically. Many of the great fortunes were diminished, some catastrophically. The labour that had been required to staff the great mansions, the dozens of footmen and chambermaids and gardeners and grooms, became increasingly difficult to maintain. The taxes that fell upon great estates rose. The cost of heating and maintaining and insuring vast houses became, for some families, simply impossible to sustain. The mansions, one by one, began to be closed, shuttered, sold, or, in the most poignant cases, demolished entirely to make way for the smaller and more economical dwellings that fit the changed economic landscape. Many of the great houses of the Gilded Age, houses that we might today consider irreplaceable monuments of American architectural history, were lost in the decades between the 1920s and the 1950s. The grand townhouses of New York fell first, sold to developers, replaced by apartment buildings and office towers, their interiors stripped of their finest fittings and the fittings sold piecemeal to dealers. The country estates were broken up, their land subdivided, the great houses themselves often torn down. Even in Newport, where the mansions had a particular romantic association that made their preservation more emotionally compelling, several of the most significant houses were lost in this difficult period. The Vanderbilts themselves experienced the full arc of this transition. Several of the great Vanderbilt mansions, including some in New York that rivaled their Newport counterparts in scale and splendor, were demolished in the 1920s and 1930s. The remaining Newport houses, including the Breakers, the Marble House and the Elms, survived in part because of an accident of timing and an act of imaginative preservation. As the family found it increasingly difficult to maintain these vast houses for use as private summer cottages, an arrangement began to develop in which the houses might be open to the public, their preservation supported by admission fees and by charitable foundations, their continued existence assured by their transition from private dwelling to public monument. The Preservation Society of Newport County, founded in 1945, played a central role in this transition. Through its careful work over the subsequent decades, several of the great Newport mansions were acquired, restored, and opened to public visitors, who continue to this day to walk through the halls and the gardens that we have been imagining together. The houses, in their present incarnation, are no longer the homes of any family, but they remain alive in a different way, available to any visitor patient enough to wander through them and to feel, in the soft hush of their preserved interiors, the lingering presence of the world that built them. There is something deeply moving in this transformation. The houses were built originally for the most exclusive of audiences, for the small circle of intimate friends and relations who could be invited to a Mrs. Astor or a Mrs. Vanderbilt's dinner table. They have become, in their preserved afterlife, available to a far wider audience, to schoolchildren and tourists and casual visitors, to anyone with the leisure to walk through their gates and to absorb their atmosphere. The democratic openness of their current life forms a kind of unintended but pleasing counterpoint to the exclusivity of their origin. And yet, walking through them today, one cannot escape the sense that we are visitors to a world that has fundamentally passed away. The rooms are preserved with great care. The furniture is in its proper place. The silver is polished and the linens are clean, but the human life that animated these spaces has receded into history. The dinners that filled the dining rooms with conversation and laughter are now silent tableaus. The orchestras that played in the ballrooms have long since gone home. The children who played in the nurseries have grown old and passed on, and their grandchildren are themselves elderly. The horses are gone from the stables, the carriages stand silent in the carriage houses. The conservatories have largely been simplified or closed. The small army of servants whose labour maintained the entire enterprise has dispersed into the modern economy and its very different patterns of work. What remains is the architecture itself, the patient stones and the carved ornaments and the painted ceilings and the polished floors. What remains is the gardens still tended by professional staff who have inherited the traditions of the original head gardeners. What remains is the long view from the cliffs out across the Atlantic, the same view that the original residents would have known, the same gulls turning in the same air, the same waves breathing against the same rocks below. What remains above all is the strange and beautiful invitation that these houses still extend to anyone who has the patience to receive it, the invitation to slow down, to listen, to remember that there once existed on these particular cliffs upon this particular coast, world of extraordinary craft and elaboration and slow ceremony, a world that made these mansions and that has now, like all worlds, given way to other worlds while leaving behind its quiet stone and wooden testimony to the human love of beauty and of permanence. The fire in the drawing-room burns lower now, the last logs settling softly into glowing embers, the room growing dimmer around us as the evening deepens. The portrait above the mantel watches us with its painted gaze, the eyes meeting our own across the long divide of time, the painted lips holding their permanent serene expression. Outside, the wind has shifted and the sound of the Atlantic against the cliffs has deepened slightly, the slow rhythm of the waves continuing its eternal patient song. We sit and we listen and we consider with a quiet and unhurried mind the long, beautiful, improbable story of this place and of those who built it. And we feel, very softly, very gently, the contented melancholy of one who has been privileged to walk for an hour through the corridors of a vanished and yet somehow still living world. As the evening softens further into the deep blue of true night, as the lanterns along the drives of the old mansions glow more steadily against the deepening sky, as the final faint light fades from the western horizon, and the stars come out one by one above the breathing Atlantic, let us drift now into the quietest and most contemplative current of all, into the long, slow consideration of why the past matters, of what it offers to those of us who wander through its remnants, what whispered lessons may rise to us from these patient stones and these polished floors, if we are willing to listen with the deepest part of our attention. There is a certain idea that the past is over, that it has happened and finished and been replaced by the present, that the only proper attitude toward it is the brisk archival attention of the historian, or the casual sentimental glance of the tourist. But standing within the old rooms of these mansions, sitting in the great library beside its slowly cooling fire, walking across the gravel of the old paths beneath the swaying canopies of trees that were planted before our grandparents were born, one comes to feel, very gently and quite unmistakably, that the past is not over at all. The past rather continues to exist in a different and quieter mode, woven into every surface and every stone, available to be sensed by anyone whose attention has slowed sufficiently to perceive it. This is not a mystical claim. Not really, it is rather a quiet observation about how human-made things carry the long memory of their making. A wall that took 6 months to build by hand carries within it, somehow, the sustained attention of those 6 months. Staircase that has been climbed by 100,000 pairs of feet has been gently shaped by those climbings, and carries the faint impression of all of them in its softened wooden treads. Library that has been read in for a century has absorbed into its very atmosphere something of the quietude and the focused thought of its readers. These things are not mysticism, but rather the natural accumulation of meaning that occurs when human attention is invested in places across long stretches of time. Among the lessons that these mansions whisper, perhaps the deepest concerns the value of slowness itself. We have walked together through this long evening at a pace that no modern day-to-day life would ever permit, lingering for many minutes upon the texture of a single curtain, drifting through the description of a single dinner table for an hour or more. This pace has perhaps felt initially strange to the modern reader. We are not accustomed to such slowness. We are accustomed to pages that turn rapidly, to subjects that change every few minutes, to the constant productive forward motion of contemporary attention. But within the rooms of these old mansions the pace was naturally slower, and for good reason. The dinner that took 2.5 hours to serve was longer than any modern meal, because the longer pace allowed for the kind of conversation that briefer meals do not permit. The journey from New York to Newport that took most of a day by yacht was longer than any modern equivalent. But the longer journey allowed for a kind of reflective transition, a gradual adjustment of one's mental atmosphere from urban to coastal, that quicker travel does not provide. The letter that took 2 weeks to reach London was slower than a modern email, but the slower correspondence allowed for the kind of careful, considered communication that hurried messages rarely achieve. The slow pace was not, in those days, considered a deficiency to be overcome by improved technology, but rather a positive feature of life, a quality that made certain kinds of human depth and care possible. Within these rooms, then, we may catch echoes of an older relationship to time, a relationship in which patience was a virtue rather than an inefficiency, in which the slow, careful unfolding of an event was understood to be more valuable than its rapid execution, which a craftsman's willingness to spend 3 months upon a single carved capital was recognized as a kind of spiritual achievement rather than an economic problem. Whether this older relationship to time was wholly admirable, whether it depended too much upon social structures that we would now regard as unjust, whether it was sustainable in any modern context, are all complicated questions that historians and ethicists may debate, but the simple capacity to recognize that another relationship to time was once possible, that human beings have lived within different pacings of life, is itself a small gift that these mansions continue to offer. Second lesson concerns the value of beauty as a serious enterprise. The men and women who built these mansions invested extraordinary resources in the creation of beautiful things. Their reasons for doing so were many and complex, including motives of social display and competitive consumption that were not always admirable. But threaded through their motives was also undeniably a sincere love of beauty, a conviction that the creation of beautiful environments was worth great effort and great expense, a belief that to live among beautiful things was a worthy goal of a human life. They commissioned painters and sculptors and architects and craftsmen with the seriousness that earlier patrons had reserved for the building of cathedrals or the founding of universities, treating the making of a beautiful house as a significant cultural and personal undertaking. This seriousness about beauty is something we have in many ways lost. The buildings we erect in the modern world are, with notable exceptions, designed primarily for efficiency and economy, with beauty considered an optional and often expendable luxury. The interior environments we create for ourselves, our homes and offices and public spaces, are frequently functional but rarely beautiful in the deep and considered way that the rooms of these mansions are beautiful. We have perhaps gained certain advantages by this shift, in cost and in democratization and in the freeing of resources for other purposes. But we have also lost something that these old houses still embody, the conviction that beauty is worth the patient investment of human attention, that a beautiful environment shapes the human spirit in beneficial ways, that our daily encounter with carved cornices and painted ceilings and polished floors enriches our inner life in ways we cannot always articulate, but can always feel. Third lesson concerns the relationship between the individual and the collaborative. Each of these mansions bears, in some sense, the name of the family that commissioned it. We speak of the Breakers as the House of the Vanderbilts, of the Marble House as the House of Alva and William, of the Elms as the House of the Berwins. This naming is not entirely wrong. The patrons did choose the architects, fund the construction, and shape many of the major decisions of design and decoration. But the houses themselves were the work, in a much deeper sense, of the hundreds and even thousands of individuals whose hands and skills brought them into being. The Italian stone carvers, the French textile weavers, the Bavarian wood carvers, the local masons and carpenters and labourers, all contributed indispensably to the final achievement. The houses are, in this sense, profound monuments to the possibility of collaborative human creation, to what becomes possible when many skilled individuals contribute their efforts toward a single shared end. This is perhaps a lesson about the nature of all great human achievements. They are almost always collaborative, even when our histories tend to remember only the names of the most prominent individual figures. The cathedral is not the work of the bishop who commissioned it, nor of the architect who designed it, but of the hundreds of workers who shaped every stone and raised every arch and laid every floor. The symphony is not the work of the composer alone, but of the many musicians whose instruments give it voice. The novel is not the work of the writer alone, but of the editors and the printers and the booksellers and ultimately the readers who bring the marks upon the page into living meaning. When we walk through these mansions, then, we are walking through a kind of physical embodiment of human collaboration at its most ambitious. Every room reminds us that human beings, when they are willing to coordinate their efforts and their skills across long stretches of time, can create things of extraordinary depth and beauty. Whether we apply that lesson to the building of buildings, or to the writing of laws, or to the teaching of children, or to the smaller and quieter arts of family and friendship, the lesson remains the same. We become, when we work together with care and patience, capable of more than any of us alone could ever achieve. The hour now is fully into the deep blue of true night, and the constellations above the Atlantic have arranged themselves into their familiar summer patterns, the great triangle of Vega and Deneb and Altair, the long curve of the Milky Way drifting overhead. The lanterns along the drive of the old mansion have been turned down to their lower setting, casting only the softest pools of light upon the gravel beneath them. Within the rooms of the house, most of the lamps have been extinguished, and only here and there a single candle or a softly glowing wall sconce remains. The house, we may say, is preparing for its long quiet sleep, settling into the deep nocturnal hush that has been its companion across more than a century of summers and winters and slow autumn evenings. We may rise now very gently from our chair beside the cooling fire, and we may walk slowly toward the great front door, our footsteps softening upon the carpet, our minds carrying away with us the many small images that we have gathered during the long evening, the texture of the marble in the entrance hall, the play of crystal light upon the gilded walls of the ballroom, the deep green hush of the conservatory with its singing canary, the warm hay sweetness of the stable courtyard, the long, slow patience of the library with its 1,000 books. We carry these images now within us, and we may, on some other quiet evening when the world has grown rushed and harsh, return to them in our memory, and find within them once again the gentle rhythm of an older world that still, somehow, breathes within its preserved stones. Now, in this gentlest of all the hours, allow your eyes to close if they have not already done so, and let your breath grow longer and slower, and let the whole of your body settle deeper into the soft place where you are resting. There is nothing more for you to do tonight, nothing more for you to remember or to follow. You have walked with me through the long corridors of these old houses, and now we may simply linger together in the soft hush at the end of the journey, drifting gently toward the deep and dreamless sleep that waits for you with the same patience that the old mansions themselves have shown across all the slow years. Imagine that the mansion around us has settled now into its full nocturnal calm. The chandeliers in the ballroom have been turned down to their faintest glow, the crystals trembling almost imperceptibly in the still air. The great fire in the library has subsided into a bed of soft embers, glowing dim red beneath the marble mantel, sending up only the smallest curls of pale grey smoke into the darkened chimney. The candles in the dining room have been extinguished one by the slow patient passage of the footman, who has walked the length of the long table with his small silver candle snuffer, lowering the gentle bell of each snuffer over each flame, watching the small light fade into a softly drifting trail of fragrant smoke. The household has gone to its rest. The lady of the house lies in her great bed beneath her canopy of pale silk, her dark hair loosened upon the pillow, her breathing slow and even, her dreams already drifting through the gardens of her childhood. The gentleman of the house lies in his own adjoining chamber, his book fallen gently from his hand onto the coverlet, his reading glasses still resting upon the bridge of his nose, his small bedside lamp dimmed almost to nothing. The children sleep in their narrow brass beds in the nursery far above, their small hands curled beneath their cheeks, their nurse asleep in her chair beside the door, the small night light upon the mantel casting only the softest pink glow across the floor. The servants have gone to their own rest in their own quiet wing. The cook lies in her narrow bed beneath the eaves, dreaming of the next morning's bread. The footmen lie in the long, narrow rooms of the men's wing, their livery hung carefully upon hooks behind the doors, their polished shoes paired neatly beneath the chairs. The chambermaids lie in their own chambers, the starched white aprons folded upon the stools beside the beds, the small alarm clocks ticking patiently upon the dressers, set to wake them in the still dark hours before dawn. The gardens are deep in their slow nocturnal breath. The boxwood hedges hold their geometrical shapes against the soft starlight. The roses in the parterre have closed their petals, drawing inward against the cool night air. The fountains have been turned off for the night, and the basins lie still and reflective, holding the entire arch of the night sky upon their dark mirroring surfaces. Single moth drifts through the air above the lawn, her pale wings catching the faintest gleam of moonlight, her flight a series of small soft loops that mark her slow patient passage across the garden. The conservatory holds its tropical hush in deeper stillness now. The orchids have closed somewhat in the cooler air. The palms stand silent, their fronds barely stirring. The fountain at the centre of the conservatory has been turned to its lowest setting, and the water trickles only in the smallest drops, each drop falling into the basin with the softest possible chime. The canary in his tall brass cage has tucked his head beneath his wing and grown still, his tiny breast rising and falling in the slow measured rhythm of bird sleep. the gentle warmth of his small yellow body radiating softly into the cool dark air around him. The stables hold the deep sweet breath of the resting horses. Triumph and Prelude stand quietly in their adjoining stalls, their large heads lowered, their eyes half closed, their long tails flicking only occasionally at some imagined fly. The riding horses have settled into their own quiet rest, the carriage horses likewise. In the carriage house the great vehicles stand in their patient silence, their lacquered bodies catching only the faintest gleam from the single low gas jet that has been left burning at the entrance for the night watchman's convenience. The harnesses hang upon their pegs, the saddles upon their horses, the brass and the silver and the polished leather all settled into the long quiet vigil of a house at rest. The kitchen has been fully closed for the night. The great range is banked low, its coals glowing dim red beneath their thick blanket of ash, ready to be revived in the early morning. The copper pots gleam in their long row upon the wall, polished and silent. The pantry doors are closed and locked. The bread for the morning has been set to rise in its great earthenware bowl beside the warm range, the dough swelling slowly beneath its damp linen cloth, performing its quiet alchemy through the night. The kitchen cat lies asleep in his accustomed place beside the still warm range, his small body curled into a tight contented circle, his whiskers twitching occasionally as he chases small dream mice through the long corridors of his sleep. The library has settled into its deepest contemplative silence. The books rest upon their shelves in their tall ranks, their spines glowing faintly in the low gleam of the single small lamp left burning upon the writing desk. The clock upon the mantel ticks its patient tick, the slow regular pulse that has been the heartbeat of the room across countless evenings. The brass library ladder stands against the eastern wall in its rest position. The dark green leather chairs by the fireplace hold the warm hollows of those who sat in them earlier, the cushions only slowly returning to their fuller shape now that the warmth of those bodies has faded. The library breathes quietly, holding its long memory close, a vast, slow repository of all the words that have been read within its walls. Beyond all of this, beyond the gardens and the buildings and the cliffs, the Atlantic continues its eternal patient breathing. The waves roll inward toward the coast in their long, slow ranks, each wave rising into a soft white crest, breaking gently against the rocks below the cliffs, withdrawing again into the deep, dark water from which it came. The sound of the waves is the same sound that has accompanied every night in this place, since long before the mansions were built. The same sound that lulled to sleep every Vanderbilt, and every guest, and every servant, and every horse, and every flower, across all the long summers of the Gilded Age. The waves rise, the waves break, the waves withdraw, the waves rise, the waves break, the waves withdraw. Hour after hour, all through the long quiet night, the waves continue their slow patient rhythm, neither hurried nor slow, neither urgent nor lazy, but settled into the perfect natural cadence of the ocean itself, the cadence that has been the underlying music of every dream ever dreamt within these walls. You may listen now to that rhythm in your own quiet imagination. You may hear the soft breathing of the sea far below the cliffs beneath the night sky full of stars. You may feel the cool air drifting in through the slightly opened window, carrying with it the salt and the grass and the faintest distant sweetness of jasmine still blooming upon the terrace. You may notice that your own breath has begun to settle into the same slow patient rhythm as the waves, in and out, longer and slower with each passage, deeper into the soft dark hush of approaching sleep. Imagine that you have been given for this one quiet night a soft warm bed in one of the upper chambers of the great old mansion, a bed with linens of fine soft cotton scented with lavender, a bed with thick goose-down pillows, bed with a coverlet of pale silk that has been turned back at the corner to welcome you. You may climb gently into this bed in your imagination, sliding between the cool soft sheets, settling your head into the welcoming softness of the pillow, feeling the coverlet draw up over your shoulders. The curtains around the bed have been drawn back, and through the open window the night air drifts in, carrying the sound of the waves below the cliffs, the faint distant chirp of the night insects in the gardens, the occasional soft creak of the old house settling around you. The room is bathed in the gentlest of darkness, illuminated only by the single small night light upon the mantel, a small pool of soft amber glow in the otherwise gentle dark. The walls of the room are panelled in dark wood that absorbs the small amount of light into a warm, silent presence. The ceiling above you is high and shadowed, holding within its vault the slow accumulated breath of the chamber. You are safe, you are held, you are gently cared for by the long patience of this house, and by the long patience of the sea, and the long patience of the sky, and the long patience of all the years that have passed across these stones. There is nothing more that you must do, nothing that you must remember, nothing that you must hold on to. Allow your breath to deepen further. Allow your body to release its small remaining tensions into the welcoming softness of the bed. Allow your thoughts, if they are still drifting, to slow and to settle, to dissolve into the same gentle rhythm as the waves below the cliffs. The waves rise, the waves break, the waves withdraw. The night deepens further around the old mansion, the lanterns dim, the stars wheel slowly across the sky above. The whole world breathes softly in the long, slow rhythm of perfect rest, and you breathe with it, drifting gently, more gently with every soft, slow breath, toward the deep, quiet pools of dreamless sleep that wait for you with patient tenderness. Drift, now drift very softly. There is nothing left to know, nothing left to remember, nothing left to wonder. The long evening has closed itself around you like the slow folding of a great soft flower, and within its gentle petals you may rest fully and completely in the warm hush of an old house, breathing its old slow breath against the cliffs of an old quiet sea. Imagine the mansion now in its very deepest state of rest, deeper even than before. The night has passed its midpoint. The stars have wheeled across the sky and begun their slow descent toward the western horizon. The first faint hint of the coming dawn is still many hours away. The whole world hangs in the deepest and quietest hour, the hour when sleep is most complete, when dreams are most patient, when the breath of every sleeper grows as slow and as even as the breath of the sea itself. Within the mansion the air drifts softly through the opened windows. The long curtains stir gently, then settle, then stir again, in the slow patient motion of fabric upon a barely moving night breeze. The polished floors hold their cool dim gleam in the tiny light from the few remaining lamps. The carved cornices high above hold their permanent shadowed dignity. The painted ceilings hold their painted skies, their painted figures floating in their painted weightlessness, their painted gardens blooming in their painted eternity. The waves below the cliffs continue their patient breath. Slow rise, slow break, slow withdrawal again, slow rise, slow break, slow withdrawal again, again. The rhythm has been so steady for so long that you may no longer be hearing it consciously, so much as feeling it in the slow rise and fall of your own chest, in the long, slow exhalation that releases everything you do not need to carry into tomorrow. Imagine, now, that you are walking very softly through the old mansion in the deepest part of the night, walking the way one walks in dreams, your footsteps making no sound at all, your passage through the rooms as silent as the passage of moonlight across a polished floor. You drift through the great entrance hall, your gaze rising up to the painted dome above. You drift through the long corridor, past the niches where the small statues stand in their pale, quiet dignity. You drift through the dining room where the long table is laid for the next day's breakfast, the white damask cloth glowing faintly in the dim light, the silver candlesticks standing patient upon their bases. You drift through the ballroom, where the parquet floor stretches like a great calm lake of polished wood, and you imagine for a single moment the soft turning of long-vanished dancers in their long-vanished waltzes, their figures suggested only by the faintest suggestion of movement at the edges of your vision, their long-vanished music suggested only by the faintest hum at the edges of your hearing. They turn and they turn, the gentleman's gloved hand resting lightly upon the lady's silken back, the lady's gloved hand resting lightly upon the gentleman's shoulder, the two of them revolving slowly through the soft gilded air, their faces tender in some dim painted contentment that has no words. You drift onward through the library, past the deep green leather chairs, past the great writing desk, past the 1,000 quiet books upon their patient shelves. You drift through the conservatory where the orchids hold their closed blossoms against the cool night air and the canary sleeps with his head beneath his wing. You drift through the kitchen where the great range is banked low and the bread rises slowly beneath its linen cloth, and the kitchen cat lies curled in his accustomed warmth. You drift up the great staircase, your hand trailing upon the carved oak banister, your feet making no sound upon the soft carpeted treads. You drift along the upper corridor past the closed doors of the bedchambers, past the soft pink glow of the children's nursery nightlight. You drift toward your own imagined chamber, the chamber where the soft warm bed waits with its turned-back coverlet, with its pale lavender-scented pillows, with its slowly stirring curtains in the soft night air. You ease yourself into the bed once more in your imagination. The cool, soft sheets receive you. The thick, warm coverlet draws up around your shoulders. The pillow holds the soft cradle of your head. Above you, the high-shadowed ceiling holds its quiet vault. Beyond the window, the sea continues its breath. Slow rise, slow break, slow withdrawal, again. Allow yourself now to feel the perfect safety of this place. There is no one who needs anything from you. There is no task that awaits your attention. There is no decision that requires your effort. The whole of the great old mansion has drawn itself around you like a vast, soft, protective shell, and within that shell you may rest fully and entirely in the peace that only true sleep can give. The breath continues, slower and slower, longer and longer. The waves continue patient and unhurried. The stars continue their slow wheel across the sky above. The whole of the night holds you with the same long, slow patience that has held every sleeper in this place for more than a century. You are part of this long patience now. You are part of this long quiet. You are part of this long, slow, continuing breath of the old houses and the old gardens and the old sea. Drift further, drift deeper. The images of the long evening soften and merge into one another. The marble of the entrance hall melts gently into the gilded ballroom. The gilded ballroom drifts into the green hush of the conservatory. The conservatory dissolves into the warm, sweet dimness of the stables. The stables flow into the contemplative silence of the library. The library settles into the soft, patient breathing of the bedchamber. All of these places are now one place, one long, continuous dream of beauty and patience and slow, careful craft. And you are inside this dream, held within it, dissolving into it. Imagine the lanterns one by one extinguishing themselves. The lantern in the entrance hall dim now to the smallest possible glow. The lantern in the corridor fading. The lantern in the dining room gone. The small night light upon the mantel of the bedchamber, the very last small flame dimming and dimming and dimming until at last it is only the faintest possible suggestion of warmth in the gathered gentle dark. The room is dark now. Soft. Complete, gentle dark, the kind of dark that is itself a kind of softness, like a great soft fabric drawn around you, the kind of dark in which sleep is perfect and dreamless, the kind of dark in which the long, busy mind grows quiet at last and rests. The waves continue. Slow rise, slow break, slow withdrawal, slower now. Even slower, the rhythm fading into the faintest possible suggestion at the edges of awareness. You no longer need to listen. You no longer need to follow. You no longer need to remain awake for any of this. Let go. Let go. Let go very gently. Let yourself slip into the deep warm waters of sleep as easily as a small smooth stone slips into a still dark pool. Let the surface of awareness close softly above you. Let the deeper silence receive you. The mansion breathes, the garden breathes, the sea breathes, you breathe, all of these breaths together form one long, slow, continuous breath that holds the whole world in its soft, slow patience. And within that breath you are held fully and gently and completely, drifting now beyond all words, beyond all images, beyond all thoughts, into the soft and dreamless rest that has been waiting for you all along. Sleep now, sleep deeply, sleep with the soft long patience of old houses and old gardens and old seas, sleep without effort and without worry, sleep with the deep contented sleep of one who has been welcomed into a great kind house for the night, and who is loved and held and protected by everything and everyone within those walls. The long evening is over. The long imagined journey through the gilded houses of Newport is over. The mansions stand quiet upon their cliffs. The gardens hold their dark, patient shapes. The sea continues its eternal breath. And you now sleep deeply, completely, with the same gentle, slow patience that has held every sleeper in this place across all the long, beautiful years. Sleep now. Sleep softly. Sleep well. Welcome to Sleepy History with Henry. Here, we harness AI to breathe new life into authentic historical records, creating an immersive auditory experience. This entire production is AI-assisted, crafted solely for relaxation and sleep support. TAND is not a substitute for professional medical advice. Please do not listen while driving or operating machinery. Now, let Henry and AI guide you on a peaceful journey through the past.